There is a quiet moment most people never talk about. It is not loud or dramatic. It happens when you realize no one is coming. Not the friend. Not the mentor. Not the version of you that thought things would somehow work out. That moment feels small, but it cracks something open. Because right there is where radical self-reliance actually begins. Here is the shock. Most people are not held back by lack of intelligence or opportunity. They are held back by a hidden contract they never agreed to out loud. The belief that someone else will eventually step in and stabilize things. That belief keeps the nervous system calm in the short term, but it quietly erodes competence. When the brain expects rescue, it stops solving. Psychologically, this is learned helplessness. When effort feels optional, the mind conserves energy and waits. Over time, waiting becomes identity. You do not even notice it happening. If that hits uncomfortably close, that is not a flaw. It is human. We are wired for social dependence. For most of history, survival depended on the group, so your brain still scans for signals of support before it commits fully. The problem is modern life gives endless illusions of backup. Credit, parents, employers, algorithms, even motivation videos. They all whisper you are not alone in this. You can lean a little longer, but deep down you already know the cost. Every time you delay taking full ownership, you feel a subtle loss of respect for yourself, not shame, something quieter, like trust leaking out. Radical self-reliance does not mean isolation or refusing help. It means the internal switch flips from "someone will help me" to "I will figure this out, even if no one does." That switch changes how your brain allocates energy. When responsibility becomes non-negotiable, the brain enters problem-solving mode. Cortisol initially spikes. That is stress. But then something interesting happens. Dopamine starts to release, not from comfort, but from progress. Small wins feel bigger. You start stacking evidence that you can handle reality. Confidence stops being a personality trait and becomes a byproduct. Think of the first time you had to handle something alone that actually mattered. A crisis, a decision, a bill, a conversation you were avoiding. You did not feel ready, but you did it anyway. And afterward something shifted. Not relief, capability. That is the psychological threshold. Once crossed, you cannot unsee it. You realize the fear was never about the task. It was about stepping into the role of the one responsible. Most people flirt with self-reliance. They try it temporarily. Then, the moment things stabilize, they hand the wheel back to something external. Radical self-reliance is different. It is when you stop outsourcing your sense of safety. You stop asking, "Will this work?" and start asking, "What do I do next?" The mind responds to that question very differently. It searches. It adapts. It becomes resilient. This is why some people seem unbreakable after a certain point. Not because life gets easier, but because their identity has shifted from dependent to capable. They still feel fear. They just no longer negotiate with it. And once that identity locks in, there is no going back to the old way of waiting. The unsettling part is that this threshold often appears during loss or pressure, when comfort is removed, when support fails, when plans collapse. That is not bad luck. That is the moment the psyche is forced to evolve. And if you lean into it instead of retreating, you unlock a level of internal strength that most people never touch. The kind that changes how you walk into every future challenge. Love without illusion. At some point, love stops feeling magical and starts feeling revealing. Not because something went wrong, but because you finally see clearly. The butterflies fade, and what remains is not romance or disappointment. It is truth. and that truth changes people forever. Here is the shock most people are never prepared for. Love does not save you. It exposes you. It brings your attachment patterns, your fears, your unmet needs right to the surface. That intense connection you call love is often your nervous system trying to complete unfinished emotional business. That is why it feels intoxicating at first. The brain is flooded with dopamine and oxytocin, bonding chemicals designed to blur perception and amplify meaning. You are not just seeing the other person. You are projecting who you hope they will be. If you have ever felt confused when love turned painful, you are not broken. You were under an illusion that biology is very good at creating. Early attachment creates emotional shortcuts. The brain fills in gaps with optimism. It downplays red flags to preserve connection. This is not weakness. It is survival wiring. As children, attachment meant safety. So the adult brain still equates closeness with security, even when evidence says otherwise. Love without illusion begins when the brain stops confusing intensity with intimacy. When you realize chemistry is not compatibility. When consistency matters more than potential. This is where many people panic. Because illusion feels good. It feels hopeful. It feels like something is happening. Reality feels slower, quieter, and less dramatic. But it is also stable. Psychologically secure attachment does not spike your anxiety. It calms it. That calm can feel boring if your nervous system is used to chaos. The threshold is crossed the moment you stop asking, "Do they love me?" and start asking, "How do I feel when I am with them?" Over time. Not on the best days. Not during apologies. Over time. Your body knows before your mind catches up. Chronic tension, irritability, or self-doubt are signals. Not of love being difficult, but of it being misaligned. This is where love becomes radical. You stop trying to earn it, perform for it, or fix yourself to keep it. You stop romanticizing effort as proof. Effort without reciprocity is not devotion. It is self-abandonment. And when you finally see that clearly, something snaps back into place. Your self-respect. Love without illusion does not mean cynicism. It means discernment. You still open your heart, but you keep your eyes open too. You allow affection without surrendering your boundaries. You can care deeply without losing yourself. This kind of love grows slower because it is not fueled by fantasy. It is fueled by trust built through behavior. What changes people forever is realizing that real love does not feel like walking on eggshells or waiting for clarity. It feels steady. It supports your nervous system. It does not require you to shrink, explain, or overextend. And once you experience that baseline, anything less becomes immediately obvious. The unsettling part is that losing illusions can feel like losing love. But what you are actually losing is the story you told yourself. And on the other side of that loss is a much deeper connection. One rooted in reality, choice, and mutual respect. Once you cross that threshold, you never chase confusion again. You recognize love not by how intense it feels, but by how whole you remain inside it. The death of the old self. Nothing collapses all at once. The old self does not die in a dramatic moment. It erodes, quietly, through small realizations that cannot be undone. You wake up one day and notice the life you are living no longer fits the person you are becoming. And from that moment on, everything feels heavier than it used to. Here is the shock people are rarely told. Growth feels like loss before it feels like freedom. When the old self starts to die, it takes familiar comforts with it. Old motivations stop working. Old identities feel hollow. Even the things that once gave you confidence start to feel performative. This is not a failure. It is a psychological shedding. The brain is letting go of a structure that no longer matches reality. The human mind hates this phase. It is wired for coherence, for a stable sense of who I am. So when that identity cracks, the nervous system interprets it as danger. You may feel tired, detached, irritable, or unmotivated. Not because you are lazy, but because the old reward systems have shut down and the new ones are not online yet. Dopamine drops. Meaning feels distant. This is why people often run back to old habits at this stage. Not because they want them, but because they want relief. If you are here, or have been here, you are not broken. You are in between. Developmentally, this is known as identity disintegration. It happens when the mind realizes a previous self-concept is no longer accurate. The ego resists because it was built to protect that identity, but something deeper is taking over. A more honest alignment between who you are and how you live. The death of the old self often follows a rupture, a failure, a breakup, burnout, a moment where pretending becomes too expensive. You realize the version of you that survived no longer deserves to lead. That version was built around coping, around approval, around safety. It kept you alive, but it cannot take you forward. This is where the threshold appears. You can numb the discomfort and rebuild the old self, or you can sit in the emptiness long enough for something new to form. Most people choose the first option because the second feels like losing everything. Your routines, your social identity, sometimes even relationships fall away. Not because you changed on purpose, but because you no longer resonate with the same roles. What makes this phase terrifying is that there is no clear replacement yet. You are no longer who you were, but not yet who you are becoming. The brain searches for certainty and finds none. But psychologically, this void is necessary. It is the space where unconscious patterns lose their grip, where you stop acting automatically and start choosing deliberately. The old self dies when you stop defending it, when you no longer explain why you are the way you are, when excuses stop making sense, when you feel embarrassed by behaviors you once justified. That discomfort is awareness sharpening. It hurts because it is honest, and then slowly something shifts. You start acting from values instead of habits, from clarity instead of fear. The nervous system recalibrates. Dopamine returns, but this time it is linked to integrity, not validation. You feel quieter but stronger, less reactive, more grounded. You do not need to announce who you are becoming because your behavior already reflects it. The death of the old self changes people forever, because once you see that identity is flexible, you stop clinging to outdated versions of yourself. You become willing to let go again when growth demands it. That willingness becomes power. The unsettling truth is that no one can do this for you. No advice or reassurance makes it easier. You have to walk through the disorientation. But on the other side is not emptiness. It is alignment, a self that no longer needs to be maintained through effort. And once you live from that place, you never fear losing yourself again. You know you can rebuild from truth. Freedom feels empty before it feels powerful. A freedom does not arrive the way people imagine. It does not feel like relief or excitement at first. It feels like nothing holding you anymore. No structure, no rules. No one telling you who to be or what to do next. And that nothing can feel terrifying. Here is the shock. Most people are not afraid of being trapped. They are afraid of being free, because freedom removes excuses. When no one is controlling you, there is no one to blame. The mind suddenly has unlimited choice, and that creates anxiety, not empowerment. Psychologically, the brain prefers constraint because it reduces decision load. Limits tell you how to behave. Freedom asks you to decide. When old obligations fall away, a job, a relationship, an identity, people expect to feel lighter. Instead, many feel hollow, directionless, even sad. This is not because freedom was a mistake. It is because meaning used to be borrowed from expectations, from routines, from approval. When those disappear, the nervous system loses its familiar feedback loops. Dopamine drops because nothing is telling you what matters anymore. If you have ever reached a long-awaited goal and felt strangely flat, this is why. The chase provided structure. Once it ended, there was silence. That silence exposes a deeper question. What do I choose when I am not reacting to pressure? That question has weight, and many people rush to fill the emptiness with new obligations just to escape it. This phase is uncomfortable because freedom initially strips you of identity before it gives you agency. You are no longer the role you played, not the achiever, not the caretaker, not the rebel, just you without scripts. The ego panics here. It wants certainty. It wants rules. It wants to feel useful. So it urges you to recreate cages that look productive. But if you stay long enough, something shifts. The brain begins to rewire motivation. Instead of acting to avoid consequences, you start acting from alignment. Dopamine slowly reconnects to choice rather than pressure. You notice that decisions made freely carry more emotional weight. They feel real, earned. This is where power begins to form. Freedom feels empty before it feels powerful because the mind has to detox from external control. Years of conditioning do not dissolve overnight. You were rewarded for compliance, for fitting in, for doing what made sense to others. When that system shuts down, there is a withdrawal period. Restlessness, doubt, boredom. This is not regression, it is recalibration. Most people never cross this threshold. They mistake the emptiness for failure and turn back. They fill their time with noise. They overcommit. They recreate urgency, anything to avoid sitting with the discomfort of choice. But those who endure this phase emerge different. They move slower, more intentionally. They no longer confuse business with purpose. Power does not arrive as adrenaline. It arrives as clarity. You start to feel grounded in your decisions, no longer rushed, no longer proving. You trust yourself to choose and to change course if needed. That trust is rare, and it changes how you relate to everything. Work relationships risk. The moment freedom turns powerful is when you realize you can tolerate uncertainty without running from it. When you can sit in the quiet and still act. When your actions are no longer reactions. At that point, freedom stops feeling like a void and starts feeling like space. Space to build a life that is not dictated by fear or expectation. The unsettling truth is that freedom demands maturity. It asks you to generate your own structure, your own standards, your own meaning. But once you do, you stop needing permission. You stop waiting for the right conditions. You move because you choose to. And that kind of power does not shout. It is steady. It is internal. And once it is yours, you never give it back. What survives after hope is gone. There is a moment people rarely admit reaching because it sounds dangerous to say out loud. Hope does not crash or disappear in a dramatic way. It just stops pulling you forward. The future you were leaning on feels distant and unconvincing. The promises you made to yourself no longer generate energy, and suddenly you are left in the present with no emotional fuel except reality. Here is the shock. Hope is not the strongest force humans rely on. It is one of the most fragile. Hope works by borrowing energy from the future. The brain releases motivation based on expected payoff. When that expectation breaks, the entire system stalls. Dopamine drops. Drive collapses, and many people interpret this as weakness or depression when it is actually exposure. The scaffolding they were standing on is gone. If you have ever felt that flat, heavy quiet, after hope fades, you know it is not panic or despair. It is numb clarity. Goals stop glowing. Inspiration feels theatrical. Advice sounds hollow. People tell you to think positive, and it feels insulting. That does not mean you are broken. It means you are no longer anesthetized by possibility. Most people rebuild hope as fast as possible because they cannot tolerate this phase. They set new fantasies, new timelines, new stories, anything to avoid standing still without guarantees. But if you stay here, something important happens. You stop lying to yourself. You stop pretending motivation will save you. You start seeing what is actually left when belief is removed. What survives after hope is gone is honesty. Not brutal negativity. Clear perception. You see the effort required, the limits involved, the reality of loss and uncertainty. Hope used to soften those edges. Without it, everything feels sharper. But sharper also means more accurate. Reality does not fluctuate the way expectation does. It does not promise. It does not betray. It simply exists. This is where a different engine turns on. Resolve. Resolve does not care about outcomes. It does not spike or crash. It does not need reassurance. It is the decision to continue, because stopping would violate who you are. Psychologically, this is a shift from reward-based motivation to identity-based action. You no longer ask, will this pay off? You ask, is this aligned? People who reach this threshold often change permanently. They stop negotiating with life. They stop asking when things will get easier. They stop building emotional dependence on future relief. Not because they gave up, but because they accepted uncertainty as a permanent condition. And that acceptance creates stability. When you stop needing things to turn out a certain way, you become difficult to destabilize. Hope says, I will endure because it will be worth it. Resolve says, I will endure because this is what I do. Hope needs evidence. Resolve needs integrity. Hope fluctuates with circumstances. Resolve deepens with repetition. It is built when you show up tired, when you act without applause, when you continue without emotional reward. This is why people who have lost everything often carry a strange calm. They are not optimistic. They are grounded. Their nervous system has already adjusted to disappointment. They are no longer afraid of losing illusions because there are none left to protect. That makes them steady in situations that shake others. After hope is gone, you stop rushing life to feel better. You stop chasing emotional highs and motivational spikes. You stop asking, how do I feel today, and start asking, what needs to be done. You measure your days by alignment, not mood, by whether your actions reflect your values even when no one notices and nothing improves immediately. You also become quieter, not withdrawn, clear. You speak more honestly because you are no longer bargaining for outcomes. You leave situations that drain you without over-explaining. You stop performing resilience. Your nervous system settles because it is no longer swinging between expectation and disappointment. It stays anchored in what is. This is where endurance becomes identity, not because you are forcing yourself forward, but because you learned you do not need belief to continue. You learned you can act without inspiration. You can move without certainty. You can stand without hope. And then something unexpected happens. Confidence returns. But it is not loud. It is not optimistic. It does not announce itself. It is grounded. You trust yourself not because you believe things will work out, but because you know you will handle whatever happens. That trust is unshakable. What survives after hope is gone is strength without illusion, resilience without fantasy, a self that does not collapse when the future goes quiet, a presence that remains even when nothing is promised. And once you live from that place, you stop fearing dark chapters. You know there is something in you that continues even when belief fails. That is the threshold most people never cross. And once crossed, it changes how you face everything that comes next. Need is not intimacy. At first it feels the same. The intensity, the pull, the way someone suddenly becomes central to your emotional world. You think this must be intimacy because it feels urgent and consuming. But urgency is not closeness, and need is not connection. Here is the shock most people miss. Need creates attachment faster than intimacy ever could. When someone fills a void, the brain lights up with relief. Dopamine spikes because something uncomfortable has been soothed. Anxiety drops. Loneliness quiets. And the mind labels that relief as love. But what you are responding to is regulation, not resonance. If you have ever felt terrified of losing someone more than excited to grow with them, this is why. Need is rooted in fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of emptiness. Fear of facing yourself alone. The nervous system grabs onto another person the way it would grab a life raft. That grip can feel passionate, but it is not mutual presence. It is survival. This is not a moral failure. It is biology. The brain is wired to seek external regulation when internal stability is low. When you feel unsure of your worth or direction, another person can temporarily anchor you. Their attention becomes proof you exist. Their availability becomes safety. But over time, that dynamic starts to suffocate both sides. Intimacy is different. Intimacy does not rush. It does not demand. It does not panic when space appears. Intimacy grows when two people are regulated enough to be present without consuming each other. Psychologically, this requires secure attachment, the ability to self-soothe, to tolerate distance without spiraling, to choose connection instead of clinging to it. Need says, I require you to feel okay. Intimacy says, I am okay and I choose you. That distinction changes everything. When need is driving the relationship, honesty becomes risky. Boundaries feel threatening. Conflict feels like rejection. You start editing yourself to keep the connection alive. That is not closeness. That is self-abandonment. Many people confuse intensity with depth because intensity is loud. It feels meaningful, but depth is quiet. It shows up as consistency, as curiosity, as emotional safety. When you are intimate with someone, you do not feel the urge to merge. You feel grounded. You do not lose yourself to keep them. You remain yourself while being seen. This is why some relationships feel intoxicating but unstable, while others feel calm but nourishing. The first feeds need. The second supports intimacy. Need creates highs and crashes. Intimacy creates steadiness. And if your nervous system is used to chaos, steadiness can feel boring at first. That does not mean something is missing. It means something unhealthy is absent. The threshold is crossed when you stop asking, do they need me? And start asking, can we be ourselves together without fear? Can we disagree without collapse? Can we be separate without panic? Those questions reveal the truth quickly. Letting go of need feels like loss because need was serving a purpose. It was protecting you from feeling alone. When it dissolves, you may feel exposed, empty, even untethered. That is not regression. That is space being created. Space where real connection can form. Intimacy requires that space. It requires two whole people, not two halves trying to fuse. When you no longer need someone to complete you, you become capable of meeting them, of seeing them clearly, of loving without control or dependency. The unsettling truth is that many connections end when need fades. Not because love was fake, but because it was built on imbalance. And that ending hurts, but it also restores you to yourself. Need is not intimacy. It is a signal, a message pointing inward. And when you listen to it instead of acting it out, you create the conditions for something far deeper, a connection chosen freely, maintained honestly, and grounded in two people who can stand on their own and still reach for each other. Loneliness becomes a teacher. Loneliness does not arrive loudly. It slips in when distractions fall away, when messages slow down, when no one is checking on you, when your presence is no longer required anywhere. At first it feels like rejection, like something went wrong. But if you stay long enough, loneliness stops feeling like punishment and starts behaving like a teacher. Here is the shock. Most people have never actually been alone. They have been unoccupied. They have been between relationships, between phase-ups. But true loneliness is different. It is the absence of emotional mirroring. No one validating your thoughts. No one reflecting your identity back to you. Psychologically, this destabilizes the ego because the self is partly constructed through social feedback. When that feedback disappears, the mind panics. The first lessons of loneliness are uncomfortable. The brain searches for noise, for stimulation, for anything to recreate a sense of connection. Scrolling, fantasizing, replaying old conversations. Even anxiety becomes preferable to silence. This is not weakness. The nervous system evolved to treat isolation as danger. For most of human history, being alone meant you might not survive. So your body reacts before your logic can intervene. If you have felt restless, sad, or invisible during lonely periods, that does not mean something is wrong with you. It means your system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. But here is where the threshold appears. If you constantly escape loneliness, you never hear what it has to teach. And its lessons are not gentle, but they are precise. Loneliness strips away performance. When no one is watching, you stop curating yourself. You stop explaining. You stop adjusting your personality for acceptance. At first, this feels empty because so much of your energy was tied to being perceived. But slowly something surfaces. Your unfiltered thoughts. Your real preferences. Your buried emotions. Without an audience, the mind stops acting and starts revealing. This is when loneliness becomes confrontational. You notice patterns you used to avoid. The relationships you tolerated. The boundaries you never enforced. The ways you shaped yourself to stay included. Loneliness does not distract you from these truths. It holds them in front of you. That is why many people fear it, not because it is quiet, but because it is honest. Psychologically, this phase forces individuation, the process of separating your identity from external validation. When you are alone long enough, the brain begins to rebuild a sense of self that is internally referenced. Instead of asking, "How am I being received?" you start asking, "What do I actually think? What do I want when no one is influencing me?" This is rare, and it is powerful. Loneliness also recalibrates attachment. When you are deprived of connection, you become aware of how you attach. Whether you chase, withdraw, perform, or numb, these patterns become obvious in silence. That awareness can be painful, but it is corrective. You stop romanticizing connection for its own sake. You stop confusing availability with compatibility. You become more selective, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Another lesson loneliness teaches is self-trust. When there is no one to reassure you, you learn to regulate yourself. You sit with discomfort instead of outsourcing it. You learn how to calm your own nervous system, how to make decisions without consensus, how to endure uncertainty without constant feedback. These are not soft skills. They are psychological muscles, and they only develop in solitude. At some point, loneliness changes texture. It no longer feels like lack. It feels like space. Space to think without interruption. Space to notice your internal rhythms. Space to move at your own pace. This is where creativity often returns. Not because you are inspired, but because your mind is no longer crowded. Many breakthroughs happen here not out of excitement, but out of quiet focus. People who learn from loneliness often become grounded in a way others cannot explain. They are comfortable in silence. They do not overtalk. They do not chase attention. They do not panic when plans fall through. Their sense of worth is no longer tied to constant interaction. That makes them steady partners, colleagues, and leaders, not because they are detached, but because they are not dependent. Loneliness also teaches discernment. When you know how to be alone, you stop accepting connection that costs you peace. You no longer tolerate relationships that require self-betrayal. You stop staying busy just to avoid yourself. That can make your social circle smaller, but it makes it real. The final lesson loneliness offers is this: you are not incomplete without others. You are unfinished but whole. Connection adds. It does not define. Once you internalize that, loneliness loses its power to threaten you. It becomes a state you can enter without fear and leave without desperation. This does not mean you stop needing people. It means you stop needing them to stabilize your identity. You can want companionship without clinging to it. You can miss someone without losing yourself. That balance is rare because it requires having faced loneliness fully instead of numbing it. The unsettling truth is that loneliness will visit everyone at some point. It cannot be avoided forever, but those who listen to it instead of running from it emerge different, more self-directed, more honest, more resilient. Loneliness stops being an enemy and becomes a reference point. Once you have learned what it teaches, you are never truly alone again. You carry a grounded sense of self that does not disappear in quiet rooms or empty days, and from that place connection becomes a choice, not a necessity. Truth has no undo button. Truth does not arrive politely. It does not knock or ask permission. Most of the time it hits in a way that cannot be ignored. One moment you are comfortable in your assumptions, in your explanations, in your stories. The next moment something undeniable appears, an observation, a realization, a piece of yourself you can no longer justify, and suddenly nothing feels the same. Here is the shock. Truth is permanent. Once you see it, it cannot be unseen. You cannot unhear what you understand, cannot unnotice what you feel, cannot untangle what your own mind now recognizes. People often confuse truth with information. But truth is deeper than data. It is clarity that cuts through comfort. Once it lands, the nervous system shifts. There is no erasing it, no retreat, no selective forgetting that truly restores the old self. If you have experienced this, you know the disorientation it brings. Suddenly, previous patterns of thought, defense mechanisms, and convenient narratives feel artificial. You try to go back to old habits and realize it is impossible. The mind resists at first. Ego fights. Social reality seems safer than facing what is revealed. But resisting truth only prolongs tension. It does not remove it. Truth has no undo button. That is why most people never face it fully. They avoid accountability, spin stories, rationalize, distract, numb. Because once truth strikes, comfort ends. It exposes every shortcut, every avoidance, every compromise you tolerated in the name of ease. That exposure feels violent at first, because it does not negotiate with hope, expectation, or denial. It simply exists. And yet, here is the strange part. Once the initial shock fades, truth becomes a foundation. It does not coddle. It does not reward, but it aligns. Decisions become simpler, priorities sharper, actions no longer rely on fantasy, but on what is real. The nervous system, though shaken, begins to settle because uncertainty decreases. You know what is true, even if it is hard, even if it hurts, even if it changes everything. The threshold appears the moment you stop pretending the truth is negotiable, when you stop arguing with it, when you accept that you cannot put it back in the box or sanitize it for comfort. That is when power begins, because truth cannot be manipulated, it cannot be bribed, it cannot be avoided, but it can be integrated. Once you do, the mind recalibrates. Clarity becomes a tool. Integrity becomes a muscle. Decision-making becomes fearless because it no longer depends on illusion. Truth exposes dependency, weakness, and self-deception. It exposes lies we tell ourselves about capability, identity, and value. And it exposes the distance between what we are and what we pretend to be. That exposure is painful because it is absolute, but that pain is transformative. It is the only force capable of stripping away what no longer serves us without mercy. The permanent nature of truth also forces responsibility. Once you see it, you cannot ignore it in relationships, in work, in self-reflection. Choices that once seemed trivial suddenly carry weight. Words, actions, compromises, all are reframed by awareness. And because there is no undo button, every subsequent step is now made in the presence of understanding. That is both terrifying and liberating. Truth has a rhythm. It strips before it strengthens. It destabilizes before it clarifies. It isolates before it reconnects. People fear it because its lessons cannot be postponed. But those who embrace it discover something rare. They no longer need validation. They no longer negotiate with reality. They no longer chase illusions. Decisions become clean, precise, and internally anchored. The nervous system is no longer reactive to fiction. It responds to what is real. The lesson is unavoidable. Once you know, you cannot unknow. You cannot retract awareness, and that is why transformation occurs. Every insight, every honesty, every reckoning compounds. You are forced to live differently, act differently, and perceive differently. The old self cannot survive in ignorance once truth takes residence. That is what makes it both brutal and liberating. What survives after truth strikes is resilience, presence, and internal alignment. You cannot escape consequences, but you gain clarity. You cannot erase what you now understand, but you gain freedom from delusion. And once you live through it, the illusions that once dominated life lose their power entirely. You act with awareness, and every choice becomes deliberate. The unsettling part is that there is no turning back, no comfort in denial, no pause button, no rewind. That is what makes truth terrifying, and that is what makes it transformative. Once integrated, it reshapes identity, perspective, and action forever. You are no longer the person who could ignore reality. You are the person who sees it fully, and nothing can undo that. Rewriting your origin story. Most people never question the story they tell themselves about where they came from. They repeat it over and over as if it is fact. The struggles, the failures, the labels, the judgments, they become permanent bookmarks in a life narrative. And because it feels fixed, people live like they are trapped in it, expecting the past to dictate every choice. Here is the shock. The origin story you carry is not truth. It is perception, memory, and interpretation wrapped together. Your brain has a habit of editing events to make sense of them, to protect you, to assign blame or identity. That story may feel real, but it is not immutable. It is a story you can rewrite if you dare. If you have ever felt stuck or incapable, it is likely because the old narrative has been running silently in the background. It convinces you who you are now is the only possible version of yourself. It labels your actions, your limits, your fears, and even your desires. That script runs automatically, and until you confront it, it continues shaping your choices without your awareness. Rewriting your origin story begins with observation. You start noticing how the past has been used as a justification, how mistakes have been rehearsed, how limitations have been accepted as destiny. This feels uncomfortable because it means questioning everything you once relied on to explain yourself. But it is also freeing because it means the past is no longer a sentence. It is material, raw, flexible, usable. The first steps are small. You start noticing moments where the story exaggerates pain or diminishes strength. You notice where it omits resilience or courage. You ask yourself what parts are actually yours and which parts were assigned by others, parents, teachers, society, even friends. Every revision chips away at the narrative that held you in place. Psychologically, this process rewires perception. Memory is malleable. The brain reconstructs experiences every time they are recalled. By consciously reframing how you interpret past events, you literally change how your mind responds. Trauma can still exist, mistakes can still matter, but they stop defining the possibilities of who you can be. Strength and agency begin to take root in place of shame and limitation. Rewriting your origin story also changes identity. When you claim the version of yourself that was resilient, resourceful, or brave, it becomes internalized. You stop acting like a victim or a product of circumstance. You start acting like someone who has been tested and adapted. Every new choice reinforces the narrative you want, creating a feedback loop of empowerment. This is where discomfort appears. The old story wants to defend itself. Ego resists because identity has been wrapped around it for years. You may feel doubt, guilt, or fear that rewriting is dishonest. It is not. It is evolution. You are not erasing facts, you are reclaiming meaning. You are learning how to interpret reality in a way that serves growth instead of limitation. Once the threshold is crossed, a strange clarity emerges. The past still exists, but it no longer controls you. Choices feel lighter. Ambitions feel possible. You operate from alignment instead of history. You can fail without confirming old narratives. You can succeed without relying on external validation. Your life becomes a story you actively author rather than one you passively inhabit. Rewriting your origin story changes perception of others as well. When you stop being defined by old narratives, you stop projecting them onto relationships, opportunities, and challenges. You see people more clearly. You evaluate circumstances based on what is, not what you have been conditioned to expect. That clarity opens doors that were always in reach but previously invisible. The unsettling truth is that rewriting your origin story is ongoing. You cannot complete it in a day. Your brain will try to default to old interpretations because habit is stronger than insight. But each conscious revision strengthens your identity, and over time the narrative becomes durable, flexible, and empowering. You live fully in the story you are choosing to tell. What survives this process is agency, self-respect, the ability to move forward unchained by old assumptions or labels. Once you rewrite your origin story, You no longer see the past as a cage. You see it as a foundation you are free to build upon, block by block, chapter by chapter. And once that realization settles in, your life stops being a story written for you and becomes one written by you. Power returns to your hands. Power does not arrive with a warning. Most of the time it slips away so quietly that you barely notice it. Decisions that once felt natural become heavy. Opportunities feel distant. Influence over your own life seems borrowed, conditional, temporary. You wait for someone else to approve, to authorize, to confirm that you are allowed to act, and in that waiting, power quietly leaves you. Here is the shock. Power was never truly gone. You simply gave it away. You handed it to circumstances, to people, to fear, to habit. The mind prefers this because it feels safer. Following rules, waiting for guidance, staying small. It reduces uncertainty. It keeps the nervous system calm in the short term. But every time you outsource your authority, a little bit of your agency is lost, and eventually life starts to feel like something happening to you instead of through you. If you have ever felt trapped, overlooked, or like your life was running on autopilot, it is not because you lack ability. It is because you were unconsciously operating under the assumption that power lives outside your control. And the moment you notice it, truly notice how much you've allowed external conditions to dictate your choices, you realize that nothing was stolen. The only thing missing was your willingness to take it back. Power returns to your hands the moment you reclaim responsibility. Not as a theory, not as a motivational idea, but as a concrete, physical practice. Every decision you make, every boundary you enforce, every action you take without asking permission rebuilds internal authority. At first it feels risky. Cortisol spikes. Fear rises. The nervous system reacts to autonomy as if it were a threat because for so long, compliance has been safety. But each time you act, confidence accumulates. Momentum grows. The internal locus of control begins to solidify. The first signs of regained power are subtle. You speak without hesitation. You refuse obligations that drain you. You make choices without consulting anyone's approval. And every time you do, the old hesitation weakens. Your mind begins to treat initiative as normal. Your energy follows. Opportunities respond, not because the world has changed, but because your nervous system is no longer waiting for rescue. Fear will show up. Always. The old narratives resist. Ego whispers that reclaiming power is selfish, dangerous, or arrogant. That is the echo of years spent surrendering authority. But power only grows when you move through the discomfort. Each step taken without permission strengthens the ability to act under uncertainty. Each boundary set reinforces that you are capable without validation. And gradually, action itself becomes self-reinforcing. Once power is restored fully, life feels both heavier and lighter. Heavier because accountability is no longer optional. Lighter because you are no longer tethered to the expectations, rules, or opinions of others. You can fail and recover. You can move decisively without asking for approval. Each choice becomes a reflection of alignment rather than external validation. The nervous system begins to reward clarity and initiative instead of reliance. Power also reshapes relationships. People respond differently when you operate from authority instead of dependency. Boundaries are respected. Influence is earned, not demanded. Fear of judgment diminishes because the internal narrative has shifted. Outcomes matter less than alignment. You no longer negotiate your identity to fit someone else's story. You act in accordance with your own standards, and the world starts to adjust. Psychologically, this is transformative. Autonomy becomes habitual. Initiative becomes instinctive. Decisions are made calmly. Reactions are measured. Energy is no longer wasted on overthinking or over-apologizing. You act from certainty, not hope, fear, or expectation. Every choice builds a feedback loop of competence, independence, and internal trust. The threshold appears when you realize that the tools were always in your hands. The external world was never the barrier. Your belief that it was, that power could exist outside your control, was the only limitation. Once that illusion collapses, every choice, every action, every decision you take carries the weight and satisfaction of ownership. You are no longer waiting for someone else to authorize your life. What survives this process is unshakable agency, presence, confidence, the ability to move, speak, and decide without waiting for permission. Power is no longer borrowed. It lives inside you. Every choice you make, from the smallest to the largest, reflects the fact that you are in control. And once you experience that, you never surrender it willingly again. You move differently. You act differently. Everything you touch carries the imprint of authority, clarity, and deliberate intention. Once the hands are free, once the nervous system no longer waits for rescue, you realize that true power was never something the world could give or take away. It was always yours to claim. And now, every moment of decision, every act of courage, every boundary enforced, confirms it. Power is returned, and nothing can erase it. The end of unanswered questions. There comes a point when the questions stop. Not because answers magically appear, not because life suddenly makes sense, but because your mind can no longer carry the uncertainty. Every why, every what if, every lingering doubt has been examined, confronted, or exhausted. And in that exhaustion, clarity begins to emerge. Here is the shock. Most people live their lives trapped in questions, cycling endlessly through possibilities and regrets. The mind prefers it because uncertainty keeps you busy. It distracts from action, from responsibility, from confronting reality directly. You spend years asking what could have been, who should have acted, why things happened. And in that repetition, you postpone living fully. The weight of unanswered questions accumulates quietly, shaping behavior without your conscious consent. If you have ever felt stuck, restless, or incomplete, it is likely because your brain has been holding space for these unanswered questions. They hover in the background like unresolved chords influencing moods, decisions, and perceptions. Most advice encourages distraction. New tasks, new plans, new people. But distraction only masks the issue. The questions remain, persistent, waiting for confrontation. The end of unanswered questions begins with willingness. You must be willing to face the unknown and accept what cannot change. Some answers will arrive clearly. Some will remain ambiguous. Some will challenge everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. But all will release energy previously consumed by doubt and speculation. This is not comfort, it is freedom. Psychologically, unresolved questions create tension in the nervous system. Your brain remains alert, scanning for evidence, rehearsing possibilities, replaying past conversations. Dopamine rewards rumination because anticipation feels like potential control. But this is an illusion. Until you confront reality, fully, honestly, the nervous system never settles. You are trapped in a limbo between curiosity and fear, waiting for an answer that may never come unless you act internally. Facing these questions requires honesty, radical honesty, not just about circumstances, but about your own choices, beliefs, and patterns. What role did you play? Where did you avoid responsibility? which assumptions were convenient lies. The answers are often uncomfortable because they pierce ego and habit. But that discomfort is necessary. It clears mental clutter and recalibrates perception. Once you confront the questions, the nervous system begins to reorganize. Energy previously consumed by uncertainty returns. Focus sharpens. Decisions become more deliberate. Choices stop being reactive and start being intentional. The mind no longer defaults to fear, speculation, or what-ifs because the space those questions occupied has been cleared. Action replaces rumination. Presence replaces obsession. This phase is transformative because it shifts identity. People who stop carrying unanswered questions act differently. They no longer defer. They no longer wait for validation or for external circumstances to provide clarity. They move decisively because their internal framework is aligned with reality, not with imagined alternatives. They measure outcomes differently, seeing each step as progress rather than a confirmation or denial of past mistakes. The threshold occurs when you realize that not all questions need external answers. Some can only be resolved internally, through understanding, acceptance, or deliberate reinterpretation. That realization shifts power back to you. You no longer depend on circumstances, other people, or future events to provide closure. Closure begins inside, and once internalized, external conditions matter less. The end of unanswered questions also changes relationships. You interact without hidden assumptions, without speculation, without guessing intentions. Conversations become clearer. Boundaries become more precise. Expectations become realistic. You stop projecting uncertainty onto others, and your presence no longer carries tension. The nervous system settles because ambiguity has been confronted rather than avoided. This process is uncomfortable because the old patterns resist. The brain prefers questions because uncertainty, though stressful, is familiar. But the moment you move through the resistance, the benefit is profound. Mental space expands. Clarity sharpens. Energy that was trapped in loops of speculation becomes available for creation, for action, for focus on what is within your control. What survives the end of unanswered questions is decisiveness, presence, and internal authority. You no longer hesitate endlessly, second, guess, or defer responsibility. You act with clarity because you have confronted the uncertainty that once dictated your choices. You no longer need constant external validation, speculation, or reassurance. You respond from insight, not from doubt. The unsettling truth is that once questions are confronted and integrated, life feels heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavier because honesty carries responsibility. Lighter because uncertainty no longer consumes your energy. Once you reach this threshold, you move through life differently. You no longer chase illusions, defer action, or postpone clarity. You operate from presence. You operate from alignment. You operate from yourself. At the end of unanswered questions, there is no reversal, no retreat, no undoing. Once clarity is experienced, your nervous system has changed, your perception has sharpened, and your identity has adapted. You carry that insight forward. You move with certainty even when circumstances are unpredictable. And that is freedom, presence, and unshakable internal authority, all born from confronting what once could not be answered. Ego steps aside for peace. Peace does not come quietly. Not at first. Often it arrives as loss, frustration, or exhaustion. You chase it through control, through arguments, through proving yourself, only to find it slipping further away. The noise in your head, the judgments, comparisons, and compulsive need to be right, refuses to quiet. And yet, There is a point where peace becomes possible. The threshold appears not in gaining more, but in letting go. Here is the shock. Peace is not a reward. It is not something you earn by achievement, status, or influence. It emerges when the ego stops defending its territory, when the part of you that insists on being seen, being validated, being correct, finally steps aside. Psychologically, the mind resists this because identity has been wrapped around defense. Ego equates surrender with loss, but in reality, the loss is only an illusion. Most people mistake ego for self. They believe that to maintain power, respect, or dignity, they must protect every position, justify every action, and respond to every perceived slight. That strategy works for short bursts but erodes peace slowly. The nervous system remains on edge, scanning for threats, calculating responses, rehearsing defenses. Over time, this constant vigilance creates exhaustion, resentment, and anxiety disguised as ambition or care. Peace begins when you stop negotiating with reality through ego. When a slight, a criticism, a failed plan no longer triggers a defensive cascade, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. The moment you allow yourself to say, "I do not need to be right. I do not need to control. I do not need to defend," something shifts internally. Stress drops. The mind slows. Presence becomes possible. The first signs are subtle. You no longer over-explain. You no longer anticipate judgment before acting. You do not carry conversations like competitions. Small conflicts no longer escalate internally. That does not mean apathy. It does not mean passivity. It means clarity. Your actions are aligned with intention rather than ego's insistence on proving, defending, or performing. The ego will resist this quietly. It whispers that letting go is weakness, that surrendering control will lead to loss, that peace is unattainable without proving yourself first. Those whispers are false. The nervous system, once freed from constant defense, begins to reward composure, observation, and deliberate choice. Dopamine shifts from validation to internal alignment. Satisfaction no longer depends on outcomes. It depends on integrity. This is the transformative threshold. Peace does not arrive by creating the perfect circumstances. It arrives when the ego steps aside. When you no longer react to perceived slights. When your identity is no longer fragile, defensive, or dependent on external acknowledgement. Presence replaces reaction. Observation replaces judgment. Calm replaces urgency. And the nervous system stabilizes in a way that neither hope, fear, nor strategy could achieve. Once ego steps aside, relationships change. Conflicts resolve more easily. Boundaries are enforced without drama. Conversations are clearer. Interactions feel less like battles for recognition and more like shared engagement. People respond differently because you are no longer projecting fear, insecurity, or defensiveness onto them. You are operating from a grounded internal center rather than reactive patterns. Peace also shifts how you measure success. Achievement no longer needs to be proof of worth. Recognition no longer needs to validate identity. Choices are guided by values, clarity, and long-term alignment instead of fear, pride, or comparison. The nervous system rewards this differently. Energy is no longer drained by constant self-protection. You act decisively because ego is no longer dictating response. This process is uncomfortable at first. Letting ego step aside feels like surrender. Old identities fight silently. Doubt arises. You question whether peace comes at too high a cost. But each act of release reinforces internal authority. Each moment you choose presence over defense strengthens your nervous system and recalibrates perception. Confidence grows, rooted in reality rather than performance. The threshold is crossed when you stop defending the version of yourself the world expects or the version you've built for protection. You stop arguing with events, correcting opinions, and performing significance. At that point, peace becomes stable, not dependent on outcome, external approval, or validation. You move through life from a place of grounded awareness rather than reaction. What survives when ego steps aside is presence, composure, and internal authority. You are no longer swayed by provocation. You are no longer ruled by validation or fear of judgment. Energy once spent on defense returns to creativity, focus, and deliberate action. Life feels fuller, decisions feel lighter, and relationships feel clearer. The unsettling truth is that ego will never disappear entirely. It is wired for survival. But peace does not require erasing it. It requires stepping aside, allowing observation to lead, and choosing integrity over reaction. Once this threshold is crossed, peace is no longer a fleeting sensation. It becomes a baseline. The nervous system settles, presence deepens, and life moves differently, effortlessly, powerfully, because ego is no longer the default driver. The price of staying. Staying is not neutral. Most people think staying is safe, comfortable, predictable. But staying comes with a hidden cost. Every day you remain in a situation, relationship, or mindset that no longer serves you, a quiet erosion begins. Energy drains, confidence diminishes, the nervous system becomes tense without your awareness. What feels familiar slowly becomes a cage. Here is the shock. The cost of staying is far higher than the cost of leaving. Staying maintains illusions, sustains fear, and normalizes compromise. You trade clarity for comfort, presence for repetition, and freedom for predictability. Psychologically, the brain interprets consistency as safety, even when it is toxic. That is why people stay far longer than they should, because the mind confuses familiarity with protection. If you have ever lingered somewhere out of obligation, guilt, or fear, you know the feeling. Small frustrations accumulate, boundaries erode, passions fade, choices that once felt easy now feel heavy. Anxiety may rise in subtle ways. A dull resentment takes root. You tell yourself it is patience, endurance, or loyalty, but underneath, the nervous system is screaming for release. The first signs of the cost are subtle. Fatigue lingers. Motivation wanes. You begin to measure your life in terms of what you are avoiding, rather than what you are creating. Mental energy that could be invested in growth is trapped in maintenance, defending a reality that is no longer aligned with your values. The irony is that the very thing you cling to for security becomes the source of instability. Psychologically, staying prolongs dissonance. Every day you ignore your intuition, postpone action, or justify inaction, your brain strengthens neural pathways for avoidance. The more you remain, the harder it becomes to leave. Habits form around fear. Identity is subtly reshaped around limitation. You begin to internalize stagnation as who you are. And that is when the real price begins to show. The cost of staying is not always dramatic. It is quiet. It manifests as doubt, low-grade frustration, and unfulfilled potential. It creates tension in relationships, drains creativity, and clouds judgment. Opportunities pass without notice because attention is stuck preserving the status quo. Emotional resilience diminishes because the nervous system is continuously taxed by internal conflict. The threshold appears when you realize that staying is an active choice, not a passive default. Each day you linger, you are choosing compromise, indecision, or fear. Each day you postpone action, you reinforce limitation. And the realization is both painful and clarifying. Freedom is not the absence of risk, It is the willingness to act despite uncertainty. Staying is risk disguised as comfort. Leaving, or changing, carries discomfort, fear, and uncertainty, but those are temporary costs. The nervous system adapts, action generates momentum, boundaries reassert themselves, confidence grows. The first steps are always the hardest because they break patterns ingrained over years. But once the threshold is crossed, clarity returns. Energy returns. Life begins to respond because you are no longer bound by what no longer serves you. This is why staying feels deceptively safe. Fear of loss, social pressure, or self-doubt convinces you that stability is worth the sacrifice. But the truth is that stagnation carries its own invisible weight, an ever-increasing tax on the mind, body, and spirit. The longer you stay, the higher the cost. And unlike leaving, the price of staying compounds silently, daily, in ways you do not see until it has already shaped your life. The psychological liberation comes when you accept that staying is not neutral. It is a choice with consequences. You cannot pretend that nothing changes because nothing will. Every decision matters, and when you finally act, whether by leaving, changing, or asserting boundaries, the nervous system recalibrates. The energy trapped in compromise is released. Agency is restored. Confidence returns. What survives after you stop staying out of fear is presence, clarity, and power. You move from reaction to intention. Choices are made from alignment rather than obligation. You no longer carry the invisible tax of avoidance. Life feels lighter, more deliberate, and more energetic because your attention is finally invested in growth instead of maintenance. The unsettling truth is that staying is always a price paid, even when it feels safe. Every day spent resisting action is energy lost, confidence eroded, and opportunity forgone. And the only way to reclaim what is being spent is to step forward, to choose alignment, and to accept temporary discomfort for permanent agency. Once that decision is made, the cost disappears and power returns to your hands. Inner authority awakens. The authority has always been promised from the outside. People told you who you should be, what you should do, and when you should act. You followed advice, rules, and expectations because it felt safer than trusting yourself. And in doing so, you ceded power. Decisions that should have been yours were outsourced to systems, people, or fear. For years, you believed authority was something to earn, to prove, or to borrow. Here is the shock. Authority is not granted externally. It never was. It exists only inside. It is a muscle that grows when you stop asking permission and start trusting your own discernment. Psychologically, the brain responds to self. Trust the way it responds to safety. Dopamine shifts from external validation to internal alignment. You feel empowered not because the world approves, but because you know you can act and respond deliberately. The awakening begins quietly. You notice small choices where you acted out of obligation, fear, or habit rather than conviction. You feel the tension of compromise, the subtle anxiety of deferring to others. That recognition is uncomfortable because it highlights how much authority you surrendered without realizing it. But awareness is the first step toward reclamation. The first acts of inner authority are deliberate, not loud. You make decisions without seeking permission. You enforce boundaries without needing to justify them. You speak your truth even when it feels risky. Each choice strengthens neural pathways for self-trust and weakens those built for reliance on external approval. The nervous system begins to reward initiative instead of deferment, presence instead of reaction. Fear will rise. That is normal. The mind resists autonomy because surrendering control is unfamiliar. Ego whispers that mistakes will destroy you, that others will judge, that your identity depends on compliance. That voice is false. Inner authority does not eliminate risk, it recalibrates your response to it. You move decisively despite uncertainty. You act not because it is easy or safe, but because it is aligned with your internal compass. As this authority awakens, life begins to shift. Decisions feel lighter because you no longer defer constantly. Choices are deliberate rather than reactive. Boundaries become natural, not defensive. Energy once wasted on appeasing, justifying, or performing is redirected toward action that matters. You notice how much was previously spent managing impressions, and the relief is immediate and tangible. Relationships transform as well. People respond differently when they sense you operate from internal authority. They notice composure, clarity, and decisiveness. Influence is earned, not demanded. Conflicts resolve faster because you are no longer projecting fear or dependence. You interact from a grounded center rather than reacting to ego-driven triggers. The nervous system adapts to stability, and trust becomes internal first, external second. Authority also changes how you measure success. You no longer define yourself by outcomes, validation, or approval. Achievement becomes a reflection of alignment, integrity, and initiative. Motivation is no longer dependent on external reward. The nervous system rewards self-direction. You act because action itself carries weight, not because it is applauded, noticed, or sanctioned. The threshold is crossed when you realize that the tools for authority have always been inside you. External approval, guidance, and validation were never the source of control. They were mirrors, distractions, or training wheels. Once that insight is internalized, every choice becomes a confirmation of self-trust. Momentum builds, confidence consolidates. Decisions that once felt heavy now feel natural, decisive, and intentional. What survives this awakening is self-reliance, presence, and composure. You no longer hesitate endlessly. You no longer defer to imagined authority or social expectations. You move through life with clarity because internal trust drives your decisions. Energy, previously spent managing others' perceptions, is now invested in creation, action, and alignment. Life becomes responsive to choice rather than dictated by circumstance. The unsettling truth is that inner authority does not arrive as a moment of triumph. It emerges gradually through repeated acts of trust, observation, and courage. Each decision, each boundary enforced, each step into uncertainty strengthens the foundation. Once awakened, it does not fade. It becomes permanent, a baseline of power, clarity, and self-directed action that shapes every interaction, choice, and moment of your life. At that point, the external world no longer defines your capability. You act because you can, not because someone else permits it. You move because action itself is grounded in certainty. And once inner authority awakens, it never truly leaves. You carry it forward as presence, power, and unshakable internal guidance, fully anchored in yourself. Fear loses its vote. Fear is loud. It shouts, whispers, and nags constantly. It takes up space in your mind and body, convincing you that hesitation is safety, that avoidance is protection, that staying small is survival. Most people live their lives voting according to fear, letting it dictate choices, delay action, and justify compromise. And the strangest part is they never notice it's happening until years have passed. Here is the shock. Fear only has power if you grant it authority. It cannot act alone. It only matters when you allow it to determine your decisions, to cast the final vote on who you become or what you attempt. Psychologically, the brain prioritizes threat detection. Fear hijacks attention because evolution treats inaction as safer than risk. But that wiring does not account for growth, freedom, or agency. It only prioritizes survival. If you have ever felt paralyzed by doubt, anxiety, or imagined danger, it is because fear has been voting in your life without consent. You may not even notice it influencing small decisions: what to say, what to pursue, who to trust, when to act. Over time, that accumulation of deferred action becomes patterns, habits, and identity. Fear votes quietly but consistently, and the Tali favors limitation. The first step to reversing it is recognition. You must notice when fear speaks, how it influences choices, and the subtle ways it shapes perception. This awareness is uncomfortable because fear thrives in unconsciousness. The moment you shine attention on it, it loses surprise. The nervous system, previously hijacked by imagined threats, begins to recalibrate. Awareness itself reduces fear's power. The next step is refusal. Every time you act despite fear, you cast a vote of your own. You demonstrate to yourself that action is possible, even under threat. Each step, each choice, each small confrontation strengthens neural pathways for courage, resilience, and initiative. Your nervous system begins to learn that survival is not determined by avoidance, that risk does not equal collapse, and that presence in action is safer than capitulation. Fear will resist. That is its function. It will whisper consequences, exaggerate dangers, and replay worst-case scenarios. Ego may even side with it, convincing you that hesitation is rational, patience is safety, and compliance is wisdom. But acting despite these voices is where true authority emerges. Every moment you prioritize decision over hesitation, courage over panic, action over paralysis, fear loses another vote. Psychologically, this creates a feedback loop. The more you act despite fear, the less credible it becomes. Neural pathways built for avoidance weaken, while pathways for agency, calm, and decisiveness strengthen. Your body begins to respond differently. Heart rate stabilizes, cortisol decreases, attention sharpens. Decisions feel lighter because you are no longer negotiating with phantom threats. The threshold is crossed when you realize that fear cannot control you unless you allow it. It is not an external force. It is a signal, a voice, an alert system that can inform but does not decide. Authority shifts internally. You act because alignment, intention, and presence guide you, not because comfort, security, or avoidance demand it. Fear has become advisory, not executive. Once fear loses its vote, life begins to move differently. Opportunities no longer feel inaccessible. Risks become acceptable experiments rather than existential threats. Boundaries are enforced without panic. Decisions are made with clarity, not hesitation. Confidence grows because it is built on repeated proof that acting despite fear is possible, sustainable, and ultimately empowering. This is not a one-time victory. Fear will return in cycles. New situations, uncertainty, or challenge will bring it back. But once you have claimed authority, it no longer casts the final vote. You can acknowledge it without obeying it. You can experience adrenaline without surrendering control. You can proceed even when anxiety whispers loudly in your ear. The liberation is profound. Energy previously consumed by hesitation, worry, and internal negotiation returns. Creativity, focus, and decisiveness are no longer taxed by invisible ballots cast by imagined threats. You move with intention. You respond with presence. You act with clarity. Fear becomes a tool, a signal, an advisory, never the decider again. What survives when fear loses its vote is agency, resilience, and composure. Life stops being dictated by imagined consequences and begins to respond to deliberate action. You operate from a place of presence rather than reaction, from alignment rather than panic, from courage rather than avoidance. And once that threshold is crossed, fear may still speak, but it no longer decides. The unsettling truth is that fear will always exist. That is biology. But you are no longer its voter, its judge, or its executor. You have reclaimed authority. You have cast your own vote, and from that place, action, clarity, and presence are permanent, unshakable, and undeniable. Growth creates distance. Growth is rarely gentle. It is not a soft accumulation of skill or knowledge. It is a process that stretches, strains, and reshapes you in ways that feel unfamiliar. The more you evolve, the more the people, places, and patterns that once defined your life begin to feel misaligned. The world you inhabited comfortably may start to feel smaller, quieter, and less receptive. That is the hidden truth. Growth creates distance. Here is the shock. Progress is rarely compatible with familiarity. When you expand your mind, habits, or presence, you begin to see patterns and dynamics that others cannot, or will not, see. Boundaries that once seemed optional become essential. Preferences that were once invisible now shape decisions. Your nervous system begins to recalibrate to higher standards, sharper clarity, and deeper alignment. And suddenly, what once fit no longer fits. If you have ever felt isolation as you improved, learned, or transformed, it is because growth naturally separates. People who cannot match your new rhythm, understand your evolving perspective, or respect your boundaries begin to feel distant. That distance is not punishment, it is consequence. Growth cannot coexist fully with stagnation, compromise, or avoidance, because the energetic requirements are different. The first signs of this distance are subtle. Conversations feel shallower. Relationships feel strained. Familiar environments no longer satisfy. You may feel guilt or doubt for leaving others behind, but that discomfort is normal. Psychologically, the mind resists separation because evolution taught humans that isolation was dangerous. Yet the discomfort signals alignment, not error. It shows that your internal map has expanded beyond the old territory. Growth also changes how you perceive connection. You no longer measure relationships by proximity or convenience, but by resonance and clarity. Time, energy, and attention are recalibrated to match your new identity. You may withdraw without malice, not out of rejection, but because staying tethered to what no longer supports you would deplete rather than nourish. Your nervous system rewards presence, integrity, and alignment over habit, obligation, or comfort. The threshold appears when you accept that distance is a necessary byproduct of evolution. Change is rarely neutral, and growth almost never preserves all existing dynamics. People who cannot adapt to your shift may drift away. Opportunities that once felt abundant may narrow. Stability may feel threatened. That is the price of expansion. But it is a price worth paying, because the alternative is remaining small, compromised, or unfulfilled. The process is uncomfortable because old attachments fight back. Ego, nostalgia, and obligation whisper that leaving others behind is betrayal. That voice is real, but it confuses loyalty with stagnation. True loyalty honors evolution, not convenience. By maintaining alignment with your growth, you stabilize your nervous system and create space for relationships and opportunities that match your current state of being. Growth also requires patience. Distance can be painful, but it is temporary in the sense that the right alignment eventually appears. New connections, new opportunities, and new resonance emerge because your energy is no longer scattered. The nervous system rewards authenticity. The mind rewards presence. What feels lonely now is preparation for a life that matches your expanded capacity. This is transformative. People who embrace the distance created by growth experience clarity, agency, and alignment. They no longer feel obligated to preserve comfort at the expense of evolution. Decisions become guided by integrity rather than approval. Energy is reclaimed from habitual compromise. The nervous system stabilizes because internal congruence replaces external negotiation. What survives this threshold is resilience, discernment, and self-alignment. You no longer fear being alone, misunderstood, or unsupported, because you understand that the separation is a natural consequence of growth. You act from presence rather than reaction. You invest in relationships and opportunities that match your evolving standards. You thrive in spaces where authenticity is rewarded. The unsettling truth is that growth always costs something. It costs familiarity, convenience, and sometimes the presence of people you once loved or relied on. But the returns are profound clarity, agency, energy, and alignment. Distance is not punishment. It is proof that you are moving forward, expanding, and refusing to compromise with stagnation. Once you accept that growth creates distance, life begins to feel expansive. You carry forward the capacity to evolve without guilt. You recognize that some separation is necessary for alignment, and you move through change with presence, resilience, and unshakable self-trust. Distance becomes a signal, a guide, and a measure of the life you are now capable of inhabiting. Pain becomes guidance. Pain is unavoidable. It arrives whether you are ready or not, whether you try to ignore it or not. At first it feels like an enemy, an interruption, a punishment, a weight too heavy to bear. Most people run from pain, numb it, or distract themselves, thinking that avoidance will protect them. But pain does not disappear. It waits, it lingers, it shapes your nervous system, often silently. And the truth is, it can become guidance. Here is the shock. Pain is not the opposite of growth. It is a signal, a compass pointing to areas of life, thought, or behavior that demand attention. The nervous system registers pain as warning or imbalance. It tells you where limits have been crossed, where boundaries have been ignored, and where internal misalignment exists. Ignoring it only prolongs suffering. Listening to it transforms experience into insight. If you have ever felt stuck, anxious, or exhausted, it is likely because you have been trying to suppress pain instead of decoding it. Every ache, every loss, every uncomfortable emotion carries information. The challenge is to stop reacting reflexively and begin observing consciously. The moment you treat pain as data rather than judgment, it begins to guide rather than punish. The first step is acknowledgement. Stop arguing with it. Stop minimizing it. Stop pretending it does not exist. That discomfort is the threshold. Your nervous system resists awareness because pain historically signals threat. But awareness does not increase threat, it provides clarity. By allowing yourself to feel fully, without distraction, you can begin to trace its origin, purpose, and message. The next step is interpretation. What is this pain signaling? Is it physical, emotional, relational, or existential? What behaviors, boundaries, or beliefs created the conditions for it? Pain asks questions: where are you compromised? Where are you avoiding responsibility? Where are you misaligned with your own values or needs? Each answer rewires perception and offers a course correction. Acting on that insight is transformative. Pain without action remains suffering. Pain that is observed, understood, and applied becomes guidance. The nervous system adapts. Cortisol spikes subside. Neural pathways are rewired for resilience instead of avoidance. You begin to recognize patterns earlier. Decisions become proactive rather than reactive. Energy that was previously consumed by avoidance is redirected toward alignment, presence, and intentional growth. This process is uncomfortable. Pain wants attention. Ego resists the lessons it offers. The mind whispers that discomfort is unfair, that relief must come from external validation, or that avoidance is smarter than engagement. That is the old paradigm. True guidance is internal. It demands presence, courage, and willingness to confront reality without denial or judgment. The threshold is crossed when you stop seeing pain as punishment and start seeing it as information. The moment you internalize that every ache, failure, and discomfort carries a lesson, life begins to shift. You no longer act out of fear, avoidance, or habit. You act with insight, purpose, and foresight. The nervous system begins to reward attention, curiosity, and action rather than suppression, distraction, or denial. Pain also transforms relationships and environments. You recognize patterns in people, habits, and situations that were previously invisible. Boundaries are enforced not out of anger, but clarity. Choices become aligned with values, not reaction. You act preemptively rather than defensively, creating a life where less energy is spent navigating suffering and more energy is spent cultivating presence and agency. The liberation is profound. What once felt unbearable becomes navigable. What once felt punishing becomes instructive. Pain becomes the teacher it always intended to be. Your nervous system recalibrates for clarity and resilience. You no longer flee discomfort. You no longer numb it. You no longer allow it to shape your identity unconsciously. Instead, it informs every action, every choice, and every boundary. What survives is wisdom, alignment, and inner authority. You move through life with awareness that suffering is not arbitrary. It is a signal. It is feedback. It is a guide pointing toward growth, presence, and self-realization. Once the threshold is crossed, pain no longer controls you. It illuminates the path forward. It becomes a compass, not a cage. The unsettling truth is that pain will always arrive. That is unavoidable, but its effect is optional. You can allow it to dominate, numb, or distract, or you can use it to orient, focus, and guide. When it becomes guidance, it transforms fear into agency, discomfort into insight, and resistance into forward motion. And from that place, life begins to respond to intention rather than avoidance, clarity rather than chaos, and presence rather than reflex. Silence replaces defense. Defense is exhausting. Most people spend their lives reacting, justifying, arguing, explaining, proving, protecting. Every interaction becomes a battleground. Every thought is filtered through the need to defend identity, reputation, or beliefs. The nervous system is on high alert. Energy is spent maintaining appearances, anticipating attacks, or rehearsing responses. And all the while, peace remains distant, because defense is noise, not clarity. Here is the shock. Silence is not weakness. It is not submission. It is the threshold beyond which defense becomes obsolete. The mind expects defense, thrives on reaction, and mistakes action for security. But real security, real presence, does not react compulsively. It observes, absorbs, and responds deliberately. The moment silence takes over, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. If you have ever felt drained by conflict, exhausted by debates, or overwhelmed by constant mental argument, it is because your energy was being used to feed defense rather than presence. Defense feels necessary, but it consumes more than it protects. Silence does not remove threat, but it removes the mental clutter that amplifies it. The first step is observation. Notice where defense arises automatically. In conversations, in emails, in relationships, in internal narratives. Observe the compulsion to justify, explain, or prove. That compulsion is habitual. It has been reinforced for years by fear ego, and the expectation that being reactive equals being safe. Recognizing it is the first step toward replacement. The next step is deliberate pause. Before responding, before explaining, before defending, take a breath. Allow space. This space is powerful because it interrupts automatic patterns. The nervous system begins to shift from hyper-vigilance to calm attention. Silence becomes a tool to reclaim control, rather than a void to be filled with reaction. Silence is not emptiness, it is presence. It communicates more than words can. Boundaries are enforced without argument. Authority is asserted without aggression. Emotional equilibrium is maintained without struggle. People notice it, even if subconsciously. They respond differently because they no longer encounter the usual defenses. They encounter clarity, confidence, and calm. The threshold appears when you stop explaining yourself compulsively, the moment you no longer need to justify choices, opinions, or identity to anyone. Silence replaces defense naturally. The nervous system relaxes because survival is no longer contingent on constant performance. Energy that was spent on anticipation and argument is reclaimed for creativity, focus, and presence. Silence also transforms perception. You begin to see interactions and situations more clearly because your mind is no longer clouded by the compulsion to protect. Misunderstandings lose their urgency. Threats lose their immediacy. You respond based on reality rather than assumption. Your nervous system no longer reacts to imagined danger. It reacts from awareness. This process is uncomfortable at first. Ego resists the absence of defense. The mind expects argument, conflict, and justification. Silence can feel vulnerable because it defies habituated patterns. But in that vulnerability lies power. Each moment of unreactive presence strengthens neural pathways for calm, clarity, and resilience. Each pause reorients identity from protection to authority. The liberation is subtle but profound. You no longer expend mental energy on proving yourself. Relationships shift because interaction is no longer a battlefield. Decisions become clearer because judgment is unobscured by fear or compulsion. You move through life with presence rather than reaction, with awareness rather than defensiveness. Energy once spent maintaining a shield now fuels intention. What survives is composure, clarity, and internal authority. Silence becomes a signal of strength rather than absence. Presence becomes a tool rather than a state to achieve. The nervous system recalibrates for calm, not vigilance. Life begins to respond differently because your energy is no longer fragmented by defense but concentrated on deliberate action. The unsettling truth is that silence is often mistaken for passivity, but passivity waits, reacts, and is easily manipulated. Silence chosen deliberately replaces defense with awareness. It is an active state of engagement without reaction. Once this threshold is crossed, it reshapes identity, perception, and interaction permanently. Peace, authority, and presence are no longer borrowed. They are lived. Once silence replaces defense, life moves differently. You speak when necessary, act when aligned, and observe when uncertain. The nervous system no longer reacts compulsively. Boundaries are maintained effortlessly. Energy is preserved. And the world, intentionally or not, responds to presence rather than panic, clarity rather than argument, and calm rather than compulsion. Choosing solitude over depletion, solitude is rarely celebrated. Most people fear it, avoid it, or fill it with noise. They believe being alone is a punishment, a sign of failure, or a risk. And yet, the truth is that solitude is not absence. It is presence. It is the space where energy, clarity, and authority are restored. Choosing solitude is not withdrawal, it is preservation, alignment, and self-respect. Here is the shock. Most depletion comes not from action, but from interaction. Energy is silently drained by people, obligations, distractions, and emotional labor that are not reciprocated or aligned with your values. Over time, constant engagement without boundaries erodes focus, motivation, and clarity. The nervous system becomes taxed, producing tension, irritability, and exhaustion. Staying connected for the sake of obligation or approval is far more draining than being alone. If you have ever felt restless, irritable, or disconnected even in company, it is because you have been trading your energy for engagement that does not serve you. Every conversation, commitment, and interaction carries a cost. Awareness of that cost is the first step toward reclaiming authority and presence. The choice is simple: expend energy to satisfy external expectations or preserve energy to cultivate internal alignment. The first step in choosing solitude is recognition. Notice where interactions feel obligatory rather than nourishing. Observe when engagement leaves you depleted rather than energized. That recognition is uncomfortable because modern culture equates constant activity with productivity and self-worth. But energy is finite, and the nervous system responds to overextension as threat. Preservation is not selfish, it is strategic. The next step is deliberate withdrawal. Solitude does not mean isolation, it means creating intentional space to recharge, reflect, and recalibrate. The nervous system begins to settle. Cortisol decreases. Neural pathways that were wired for reactive behavior shift toward presence and agency. Thought patterns become clearer. Decisions become deliberate rather than reactive. Presence replaces overwhelm. This is where discomfort appears. Ego resists solitude because it feels like deprivation or failure. Social conditioning tells you that being alone is risky, unproductive, or shameful. But the truth is that depletion is far more dangerous. Acting from exhaustion leads to compromise, poor decisions, and eroded boundaries. Choosing solitude is a preventive act. It ensures that energy is restored before it is spent, that clarity returns before it is clouded, that alignment is preserved before it is broken. The threshold is crossed when solitude becomes preferred over unnecessary engagement. When you prioritize being aligned, energized, and present over performing for others, social pressure, or habit, something shifts. You move with clarity. You interact with purpose rather than compulsion. The nervous system rewards this choice. Energy is no longer scattered but consolidated, attention is focused, and resilience grows. Choosing solitude also transforms relationships. People who respect your boundaries, your time, and your energy remain. Interactions become deliberate, meaningful, and aligned rather than habitual or draining. Conversations deepen because they occur from presence rather than exhaustion. You act not to satisfy expectations but to maintain integrity, clarity, and balance. Psychologically, this practice rewires the mind for autonomy. Neural pathways for self-trust, agency, and resilience strengthen. You no longer rely on external validation to justify engagement. Decisions become guided by alignment rather than obligation. The nervous system stabilizes because energy is replenished, not depleted. Presence becomes habitual rather than rare. The liberation is profound. Solitude is no longer a threat or a void. It becomes a source of clarity, energy, and authority. It allows reflection, creativity, and discernment to thrive. Boundaries are enforced naturally. Decisions are made intentionally. Life becomes responsive to presence rather than dictated by exhaustion or compulsion. What survives this practice is resilience, focus, and internal authority. You move through life with energy intact, presence unfragmented, and clarity unclouded. You no longer fear being alone because solitude is now your ally, not a punishment. Interaction becomes deliberate, not habitual. Engagement becomes sustainable, intentional, and empowering. The unsettling truth is that modern life rarely encourages solitude. It glorifies constant activity, performance, and connection. But choosing solitude over depletion is not avoidance. It is strategy. It is the recognition that energy, clarity, and presence are the currency of effectiveness, authority, and alignment. Once you make that choice consistently, life moves differently. You operate from strength rather than exhaustion, presence rather than distraction, and intention rather than compulsion. Once solitude becomes preference, it no longer feels like isolation. It becomes a source of power, creativity, and alignment. Boundaries are natural. Decisions are deliberate. Energy is preserved. Presence deepens. And from that space, life responds not to noise, obligation, or expectation, but to the authority, clarity, and focus that only intentional solitude can provide. Boundaries without explanation, boundaries are rarely respected. Most people feel compelled to justify, explain, or defend them. You say no, and immediately the mind scrambles for reasons, rationales, or excuses. You justify to avoid conflict, guilt, or misunderstanding. But the truth is, boundaries do not require permission, validation, or explanation. They are statements of presence, values, and self-respect. And they work best when they are unarguable. Here is the shock. Every time you feel the need to explain a boundary, you weaken it. Psychologically, justification invites negotiation, debate, and reinterpretation. It shifts power from you to others, even subtly. The nervous system reacts to this surrender by reinforcing uncertainty, self-doubt, and tension. Boundaries that are explained become conditional. Boundaries that are simply enforced become absolute. If you have ever felt drained by interactions where your limits were ignored, overlooked, or debated, it is likely because explanation diluted authority. You offered reasoning to preserve harmony, avoid conflict, or earn consent, but the cost was clarity. Energy was spent defending a limit instead of observing its enforcement. The nervous system remained alert, waiting for challenge or pushback, instead of settling into presence. The first step is recognition. Notice when you feel compelled to justify yourself. Notice the internal pressure to persuade, convince, or soften. That compulsion is habitual, reinforced by social norms and fear of judgment. Recognizing it is the threshold. It signals the moment when authority can shift back into your control. The next step is enforcement without explanation. State your limit simply, calmly, and without argument. No tone of apology. No invitation for negotiation. No rehearsed justification. Just presence and clarity. Your nervous system will respond to this differently. Cortisol spikes ease. Neural pathways for agency and confidence strengthen. Action aligns with integrity rather than reaction. This approach feels uncomfortable at first. Ego may fear judgment, rejection, or confrontation. Social conditioning tells you that others must understand, agree, or accept, but compliance or consensus is irrelevant. Boundaries exist for alignment, not approval. Each act of enforcement without explanation reinforces internal authority and rewires the nervous system to trust presence over persuasion. The threshold is crossed when you realize that boundaries are not negotiable statements. They are declarations of self, respect, and alignment. Enforcement without explanation creates consistency, reduces conflict, and preserves energy. People adjust naturally when limits are clear, uncompromised, and unargued. The nervous system no longer remains in anticipatory tension, because authority is now absolute rather than conditional. Boundaries without explanation also reshape relationships. They clarify roles, responsibilities, and expectations without debate. Interactions become more intentional. Energy is no longer spent defending limits, but applied to alignment and presence. Respect emerges naturally because boundaries are no longer presented as requests. They are facts of your engagement. Psychologically, this practice rewires the mind for autonomy. Neural pathways built for negotiation, justification, or permission weaken. Pathways for decisiveness, clarity, and presence strengthen. Confidence emerges not from consent or agreement, but from alignment and integrity. The nervous system adapts to predictability and certainty, reducing internal conflict and enhancing focus. The liberation is profound. You no longer expend mental energy persuading, defending, or explaining. You act from clarity and authority rather than reaction or insecurity. Life becomes responsive to presence rather than debate. Decisions are reinforced by alignment, not by consensus. Boundaries exist effortlessly, clearly, and permanently. What survives is self-respect, agency, and composure. You move through life without negotiation fatigue. People respond to clarity, not persuasion. The nervous system relaxes because authority is internal and absolute. Engagement becomes deliberate, sustainable, and aligned rather than reactive, exhausting, or compromised. The unsettling truth is that explanation feels necessary because social conditioning equates compliance with safety. But boundaries enforced without explanation are far more effective than any argument, rationale, or justification. Once this threshold is crossed, energy is preserved, authority is reclaimed, and presence becomes the foundation of every interaction. Once boundaries are unarguable, life shifts. Decisions are clear, interactions are purposeful, energy is intact, presence deepens, and from that space authority, clarity, and integrity guide every choice without compromise or negotiation. Love without self-erasure. Most people believe love requires sacrifice. They think it demands bending, hiding, or erasing parts of themselves to fit someone else's expectations. And for a time, it works. Superficially, the other person is satisfied, the mind feels safe, and the illusion of harmony persists. But inside, something quietly dies, energy drains, presence fades, boundaries dissolve, selfhood is compromised, and over time, what you think is love is really survival. Here is the shock. True love does not require self-erasure. Love is not sustainable when it demands compromise of integrity. Psychologically, the brain interprets constant suppression as stress. Cortisol rises, anxiety accumulates, identity weakens. The nervous system signals imbalance because authentic expression has been constrained. Over time, the heart may stay, but the mind and body pay the cost. If you have ever felt resentful, unseen, or depleted in a relationship, it is likely because self-erasure has taken root. You gave too much, adapted too often, or silenced too completely. What you mistook for generosity was actually compliance. What you mistook for care was actually avoidance. And the paradox is cruel. The more you erased yourself, the further love drifted from fulfillment. The first step is recognition. Notice where you shrink, censor, or compromise in the name of love. Observe patterns of habit, fear, or obligation. That recognition is uncomfortable because the ego and social conditioning have long told you that self-sacrifice is noble, relationally necessary, or proof of devotion. But that belief is false. Sacrifice without alignment is depletion masquerading as love. The next step is assertion. You begin to honor needs, preferences, and boundaries without apology. You voice opinions, desires, and concerns even when it feels risky. You act from presence rather than fear of rejection. Every small act of self-alignment rewires the nervous system. Energy returns. Confidence grows. Love begins to feel sustainable because it now rests on authenticity, not suppression. This is where resistance appears. Fear whispers that asserting yourself will create conflict, rejection, or loss. Ego tells you that love is conditional and that being fully visible is dangerous. That is the old paradigm. True love does not demand erasure. It demands presence, honesty, and alignment. Each act of self-expression strengthens the nervous system and demonstrates that connection does not require compromise of integrity. The threshold is crossed when love is experienced without negotiation of self. The moment you realize that authentic presence is not a threat to relationship, but its foundation, everything shifts. You no longer tolerate depletion. You no longer silence needs. You no longer compromise identity to maintain harmony. The nervous system rewards clarity, integrity, and aligned connection over habitual compliance. Love without self-erasure transforms relationships. Boundaries are natural. Interaction becomes intentional. Conflict diminishes because transparency replaces manipulation or silence. Energy is no longer siphoned to maintain the illusion of harmony. The connection deepens because it is based on authenticity rather than performance. Both parties are free to show up fully, creating space for genuine intimacy. Psychologically, this practice rewires the brain for resilience, agency, and presence. Neural pathways built for suppression, avoidance, and self-erasure weaken. Pathways for alignment, assertiveness, and authentic engagement strengthen. Anxiety diminishes. Emotional energy is reclaimed. Decisions, interactions, and expressions are guided by integrity rather than fear. The liberation is profound. You no longer confuse compliance with love. You no longer sacrifice identity for harmony. You act from self-alignment, clarity, and presence. Life becomes responsive to authenticity rather than approval. Love becomes sustainable because it is no longer dependent on suppression, performance, or avoidance. It thrives on mutual presence. What survives is integrity, confidence, and authentic connection. You move through relationships without depletion. Presence, energy, and clarity are intact. Boundaries are natural. Vulnerability becomes strength. The nervous system stabilizes because love is no longer a negotiation between survival and authenticity. It is a partnership between aligned selves. The unsettling truth is that many people avoid this threshold because self-erasure feels safe. But safety without authenticity is hollow. Love without self-erasure may feel uncomfortable at first because old patterns resist. But the result is freedom, alignment, and connection that is both deep and sustainable. Once this threshold is crossed, love no longer diminishes. It amplifies presence, energy, and selfhood. Once you embrace love without self-erasure, life changes. You give without losing. You connect without compromise. You act from presence rather than fear. Energy is preserved. Boundaries are honored. Intimacy deepens. And from that space, love is no longer a source of depletion, but a reflection of alignment, integrity, and unshakable self-respect. Stability over survival. Most people think survival is enough. They measure life by what keeps them alive, what avoids danger, what prevents loss. And for a while, that mindset works. You survive, you endure, you meet obligations, you react to threats. But survival alone does not sustain presence, clarity, or growth. It keeps you alive but not alive fully. It prioritizes reaction over intention, fear over alignment, and anxiety over agency. Here is the shock. Stability is far more powerful than survival. Survival reacts, stability responds. Survival clings. Stability chooses. Psychologically, the nervous system thrives not under constant threat, but under predictable, aligned conditions. When life is reduced to survival mode, the brain remains alert, reactive, and exhausted. Energy is consumed by vigilance rather than creation, by fear rather than clarity. If you have ever felt restless, drained, or fragmented despite making it through, it is likely because survival has dominated your decisions. You act from urgency, react to external pressures, and maintain control through fear. Every choice is measured against risk, avoidance, or temporary safety, rather than long-term alignment, energy, and presence. The nervous system compensates by keeping tension elevated, prioritizing caution over insight. The first step is recognition. Notice where survival instincts dominate rather than conscious choice. Observe patterns of overreaction, compromise, or deferment. That discomfort is a threshold. It signals where energy is being spent maintaining life instead of cultivating living. Awareness creates the opportunity to shift from reaction to presence. The next step is deliberate action towards stability. Stability is not passive. It requires choices that align with long-term energy, clarity, and resilience rather than immediate gratification or temporary safety. Boundaries are enforced. Habits are designed. Attention is directed intentionally. Over time, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. Cortisol decreases. Focus sharpens. Energy that was trapped in vigilance becomes available for creation, presence, and growth. This shift is uncomfortable because survival feels urgent, familiar, and safe. Ego resists the notion that long-term alignment requires temporary discomfort. Fear whispers that stability is slow, that patience is weakness, and that immediate risk avoidance is essential. That is the old paradigm. True stability demands presence, discipline, and integrity. It sacrifices short-term comfort for enduring agency. The threshold is crossed when you consistently choose alignment over reactive safety. When you prioritize presence, clarity, and internal equilibrium over temporary comfort, something changes. Survival ceases to dictate choices. The nervous system no longer defaults to hypervigilance. Decisions are made from calm authority, not anxious compulsion. Presence replaces panic. Clarity replaces urgency. Stability over survival transforms life. Opportunities are pursued from aligned energy rather than desperation. Relationships are engaged intentionally rather than reactively. Boundaries are maintained consistently, not in response to fear. Creativity, focus, and agency expand because the nervous system is no longer taxed by constant threat assessment. Energy becomes a resource, not a debt. Psychologically, this practice rewires the mind for resilience and foresight. Neural pathways built for fear-based reaction weaken. Pathways for deliberate presence, strategic action, and agency strengthen. Confidence grows because actions are guided by alignment rather than reflex. The nervous system stabilizes in response to predictability, clarity, and consistency rather than constant alert. The liberation is profound. Survival mode drains vitality. Stability preserves it. Energy, attention, and presence are intact. Decisions become deliberate. Life feels expansive instead of defensive. You move through circumstances with composure rather than urgency. Your internal state dictates response, not external pressures. The nervous system adapts to presence, not reaction. What survives this threshold is calm authority, clarity, and self-directed energy. You operate from alignment rather than compulsion. Risk is assessed intelligently, not feared. Boundaries, habits, and attention are curated intentionally. Presence becomes habitual, energy becomes reliable, and life becomes responsive rather than reactive. The unsettling truth is that survival feels urgent, familiar, and safe, but it is a low ceiling. It sustains life without cultivating living. Stability, by contrast, requires conscious action, internal authority, and patience. Once you prioritize stability over survival, you reclaim energy, presence, and clarity. You operate from agency rather than reaction, from alignment rather than urgency, and from that place, life is no longer endured. It is intentionally lived. Once stability takes precedence, the nervous system relaxes, clarity expands, and energy consolidates. Choices are deliberate, relationships are aligned, and presence becomes natural. Life stops being about avoiding danger and starts being about cultivating enduring power, agency, and fulfillment. Mental release from yesterday. Yesterday is a heavy place. Memories, regrets, arguments, mistakes, they linger long after events have passed. Most people carry yesterday like a backpack full of rocks, thinking it will prepare them for today. But what it really does is weigh them down. Energy is trapped. Clarity fades. Presence is impossible. The nervous system stays tense, replaying scenarios that no longer exist, rehearsing outcomes that cannot change. Here is the shock. Holding on to yesterday does not protect you. It does not correct mistakes or create opportunities. It only extends pain, guilt, and tension. Psychologically, rumination keeps neural circuits active that are designed for problem solving, not closure. The mind interprets the past as ongoing threat when you fail to release it, keeping you in a state of subtle, chronic stress. If you have ever woken up tired from thoughts that belong to someone else's expectation, a conversation you cannot undo, or a mistake that cannot be erased, you know the cost. Every moment spent reliving the past steals energy from presence. Decisions, focus, and creativity are compromised. Life is moving forward, but attention is still chained to events that are over. The first step is acknowledgement. You must recognize the thoughts, feelings, and patterns you are carrying. Notice the tension in your body, the mental loops that play on repeat. That discomfort is a threshold. It signals that the nervous system has been holding on longer than necessary. Awareness begins the process of release, because what is observed can eventually be let go. The next step is deliberate detachment. This is not denial. It is not pretending the past did not happen. It is the conscious act of separating identity from memory. You are not your mistakes, regrets, or old conflicts. You are present, alive, and capable now. Each act of mental release strengthens neural pathways for clarity, focus, and resilience, and weakens pathways tied to rumination, anxiety, and attachment. This practice is uncomfortable at first. The mind resists because it is familiar with carrying yesterday. Ego convinces you that remembering is responsible, that replaying mistakes prevents repetition, that holding on is cautious. That is the old paradigm. True mental release requires courage, presence, and the decision to reclaim energy for now, not later. The threshold is crossed when you consistently let go of what no longer serves. Each time you catch yourself ruminating and choose presence instead, you reclaim energy. The nervous system recalibrates. Cortisol decreases. Attention shifts from replay to response. Decisions are no longer filtered through old tension, but made from clarity and alignment. Presence becomes natural rather than forced. Mental release transforms perception. Relationships are experienced in the present rather than filtered through past arguments. Opportunities are assessed objectively rather than through the lens of prior failures. Emotional energy that was once consumed by guilt, resentment, or regret is now available for creation, focus, and engagement. You act from clarity rather than reaction. Psychologically, this rewires the brain for resilience and adaptability. Neural pathways built for rumination weaken, while pathways for attention, intentional action, and presence strengthen. Confidence grows because actions are no longer limited by yesterday's shadow. The nervous system stabilizes, no longer trapped in cycles of replay and anticipation. The liberation is profound. Life becomes lighter. Energy is reclaimed. Decisions are clearer. Presence deepens. The past no longer dictates your response, but informs insight when necessary. You operate from awareness, clarity, and internal authority rather than compulsion, guilt, or fixation. What survives is freedom, composure, and focus. You move through time unburdened by what cannot be changed. Energy flows to what matters now. Thoughts, decisions, and emotions are no longer hijacked by history. You are aligned, grounded, and present. The unsettling truth is that yesterday will always exist, but its power over you is optional. Mental release is a choice, a practice, and a threshold of awareness. Once crossed, the nervous system relaxes, clarity deepens, and life becomes responsive to presence rather than repetition. Energy, focus, and action are liberated from what no longer matters. Once mental release from yesterday is achieved, the mind becomes lighter, perception sharper, and life more immediate. Past mistakes, regrets, or tensions may exist, but they no longer define decisions, drain energy, or cloud presence. You act from now, from alignment, and from clarity. Life responds to you rather than the past, and presence becomes the foundation of every thought, choice, and action. Waking up midlife. Waking up midlife does not arrive gently. It is not a celebration or a breakthrough moment people post about. It often shows up as discomfort you cannot explain, a quiet dissatisfaction, a sense that something is off even though nothing is technically wrong. You look at your life and realize you followed the plan, met expectations, stayed responsible, and still feel disconnected. That realization is the beginning, and it is unsettling. Here is the shock. Waking up midlife is not a crisis. It is awareness catching up to momentum. For years, survival, routine, and obligation carried you forward. Decisions were made quickly because there was no time to question them. But eventually, the nervous system slows enough to notice misalignment. What once felt normal now feels heavy. What once felt meaningful now feels hollow. That is not failure. That is consciousness returning. Most people try to silence this awakening. They distract themselves with productivity, nostalgia, or responsibility. They tell themselves to be grateful, to push through, to not disrupt what works. But the body does not lie. Fatigue deepens. Irritation grows. Motivation fades. The nervous system begins signaling that the life you built no longer matches who you are becoming. The first stage of waking up midlife is grief. You grieve the years spent on autopilot. You grieve choices made without awareness. You grieve versions of yourself that survived but never fully lived. This grief feels dangerous because it threatens identity, but it is necessary. Psychologically, the brain must release old narratives before new ones can form. Grief clears space. Then comes disorientation. You no longer know what you want, but you know what you no longer tolerate. Old goals feel empty. Old rewards feel insufficient. You may feel lost, detached, or restless. This is not confusion. It is recalibration. The nervous system is shedding survival patterns and searching for stability rooted in alignment rather than momentum. Waking up midlife also brings honesty. Brutal honesty. You see where you compromised, where you stayed too long, where you chose comfort over truth. This awareness can feel heavy, but it is powerful. Once seen, these patterns cannot be unseen. The mind begins reorganizing priorities. Energy shifts away from proving and toward meaning. Presence becomes more important than performance. This is where fear intensifies. Fear of change, fear of loss, fear of disrupting stability. Ego panics because it built an identity around endurance and consistency. It warns you that it is too late, too risky, too selfish to change now. That voice is loud, but it is outdated. It was built to survive earlier chapters, not to guide the next one. The threshold is crossed when you stop trying to go back to sleep, when you stop numbing the discomfort and start listening to it. The nervous system responds immediately. Attention sharpens. Energy returns in unexpected ways. Not excitement, but clarity. You begin making small choices differently. You say no without explanation. You choose rest without guilt. You stop pretending satisfaction where there is none. Waking up midlife changes how you relate to time. Urgency fades. You no longer rush to accumulate or impress. Time becomes precious not because it is scarce, but because it is finally yours. Decisions are slower, more deliberate. You invest energy where it matters. You stop chasing outcomes and start cultivating alignment. Relationships change too. Some deepen. Some dissolve. You no longer tolerate dynamics built on roles you have outgrown. This can feel lonely, but it is honest. The nervous system prefers solitude over misalignment. You begin choosing peace over familiarity, depth over history, presence over obligation. Psychologically, this awakening rewires motivation. Dopamine is no longer driven by achievement alone. It responds to meaning, autonomy, and coherence. You feel satisfaction not from being busy, but from being aligned. Life becomes quieter, but more real. Less impressive, but more grounded. What survives waking up midlife is not regret, but authority. You stop living by default. You stop outsourcing decisions to expectations or fear. You take responsibility for the remaining chapters without self-punishment. You understand that waking up now is not late, it is precise. It happens when the nervous system is ready to sustain truth. The unsettling truth is that not everyone wakes up. Many stay asleep because awakening demands change. But once you wake up, you cannot unknow what you know. And that is not a curse. It is an invitation. From this point forward, life is no longer about survival or approval. It becomes about coherence, about living in a way that your body, mind, and values agree with. Waking up midlife is not the end of anything. It is the moment life stops happening to you and starts responding to you. Guilt no longer follows. Guilt follows most people quietly. It does not shout. It whispers. It shows up after rest, after saying no, after choosing yourself, after changing your mind. It convinces you that freedom has a cost and that cost is self-punishment. For years, guilt keeps people obedient, exhausted, and small. Not because they are wrong, but because they were trained to confuse responsibility with self-betrayal. Here is the shock. Guilt is not proof of wrongdoing. It is proof of conditioning. Psychologically, guilt is a learned emotional response tied to approval, belonging, and fear of rejection. The nervous system associates compliance with safety and autonomy with threat. So when you act in alignment with yourself, guilt appears not to correct you, but to pull you back into familiarity. If you have ever felt guilty for resting, for leaving, for changing, for outgrowing someone, for prioritizing peace, You know this pattern. The guilt feels personal, but it is inherited. It was built in environments where your needs were secondary, your boundaries were inconvenient, and your worth was tied to usefulness or performance. Guilt was the leash that kept you close. The first shift happens when you stop obeying guilt automatically. You notice it arise without immediately reacting. You feel it in the body as tightness, heaviness, or pressure. That awareness is powerful. The nervous system begins to separate emotion from command. Just because guilt appears does not mean you did something wrong. It means you stepped outside an old pattern. This is uncomfortable. Guilt has long been used as a moral compass, even when it was inaccurate. Letting go of it can feel dangerous, like losing your guide. Ego warns that without guilt you will become selfish, careless, or cruel. That is false. Guilt does not create integrity. Presence does. Alignment does. Values do. The threshold is crossed when you choose alignment, even while guilt is present. You rest anyway. You say no anyway. You leave anyway. You choose yourself anyway. And something unexpected happens. The world does not collapse. You do not become a worse person. In fact, the nervous system begins to relax because it is no longer living in constant self-correction. Guilt fades when it is no longer rewarded. Each time you act without punishing yourself, you teach the brain a new association. Autonomy no longer equals danger. Boundaries no longer equal rejection. Rest no longer equals laziness. Neural pathways tied to self-trust strengthen. Cortisol decreases. Decision-making becomes clearer because it is no longer filtered through shame. This does not happen overnight. Guilt may still appear for a while, especially around old roles and relationships. But it no longer follows. It lingers briefly, then dissolves. You stop carrying it with you. You stop rehearsing explanations in your head. You stop compensating for choices that are simply honest. Relationships change here. Some people will resist your lack of guilt. They benefited from it. They were comfortable when you overgave, overexplained, or overextended. Your calm will feel unfamiliar to them. That is not your responsibility. Guilt-free boundaries are not cruel. They are clear, and clarity is kinder than resentment. Internally, something stabilizes. You no longer wake up negotiating with yourself. You no longer end days replaying decisions. Energy returns because it is no longer siphoned into self-judgment. Presence deepens because attention is no longer split between action and punishment. You begin to trust yourself not because you are perfect, but because you are honest. Psychologically, this is liberation from internal surveillance. You are no longer monitoring yourself for moral failure every time you choose ease or alignment. Motivation shifts. You act from values, not fear. From intention, not obligation. The nervous system settles into stability instead of constant correction. What replaces guilt is responsibility without self-violence. You still care. You still reflect. You still adjust when necessary, but you do not collapse inward for choosing yourself. You do not confuse discomfort with wrongdoing. You do not punish growth. The unsettling truth is that guilt kept you controllable. Releasing it makes you sovereign. That is why it feels radical. That is why it feels quiet and powerful at the same time. When guilt no longer follows, decisions become simpler. Life becomes lighter. Presence becomes natural. You begin to move forward without dragging an emotional anchor behind you. You stop apologizing for existing fully. You stop explaining your boundaries. You stop paying emotional debt for past versions of yourself. And from that place, life responds differently. Not louder, not faster, but cleaner, calmer, more honest. Guilt no longer follows because it is no longer needed. You are no longer surviving approval. You are living in alignment. Urgency replaces waiting. Urgency does not arrive as panic. It arrives as clarity, a quiet but undeniable sense that waiting is no longer neutral. For a long time, waiting felt responsible, safe, mature. You told yourself timing mattered, conditions had to be right, clarity had to come first. But eventually something shifts. Waiting starts to feel heavy. Not patient, but costly. You realize time has been passing whether you decide or not. Here is the shock. Waiting is often disguised fear. Psychologically, the brain prefers delay because it postpones risk. It convinces you that more information, more confidence, or more certainty will make action safer. But certainty rarely arrives before movement. It arrives because of it. Waiting feels calm on the surface, but underneath, it keeps the nervous system suspended in low-grade tension. If you have ever felt restless, distracted, or quietly frustrated while doing nothing wrong, this is why. Part of you knows something needs to move. A conversation, a decision, a boundary, a change. And every day you delay, energy leaks, motivation dulls, confidence erodes. You are not at peace. You are paused. Urgency replaces waiting when awareness sharpens. You see clearly that time is not an abstract concept anymore. It is embodied. It is measured in energy, attention, and remaining willingness. This is not desperation. It is precision. You stop fantasizing about the perfect moment and start respecting the present one. The first sign of healthy urgency is intolerance for misalignment. You no longer tolerate conversations that go nowhere, plans that never happen, roles that no longer fit. You feel an internal pressure not to rush, but to act honestly. The nervous system begins signaling that stagnation is now the threat, not movement. This urgency is calm, not frantic. It does not scream. It does not scatter. It focuses. You stop waiting for permission, validation, or reassurance. You understand that waiting has been a way to avoid responsibility for outcome. Acting means owning consequence. And you are finally ready for that. Psychologically, urgency activates agency. Dopamine shifts from anticipation to execution. The brain stops looping on possibilities and starts organizing behavior. Anxiety decreases because uncertainty is replaced with movement. Even imperfect action stabilizes the nervous system more than endless deliberation ever could. The threshold is crossed when you choose motion over comfort, when you decide that clarity will come after the step, not before it. You send the message. You make the call. You leave the room. You start the work. You stop rehearsing and start responding, and immediately something unlocks, energy returns. Attention sharpens. Self-trust grows. Urgency also changes how you relate to fear. Fear no longer stops you. It informs you, but it does not delay you. You understand that fear will be present whether you wait or act. Waiting just prolongs it. Acting metabolizes it. The nervous system prefers resolution over suspension. This does not mean reckless action. It means aligned action. You are not chasing everything. You are choosing what matters. Urgency narrows focus. It removes excess. You stop investing in what drains you because you can feel the cost now. Time is no longer theoretical. It is personal. Relationships shift here too. You stop lingering in ambiguity. You say what needs to be said. You stop keeping people warm who will never meet you fully. This may feel abrupt to others, but it is honest. You are no longer available for endless almosts. Internally, something stabilizes. You stop waking up feeling behind. You stop ending days with unfinished emotional business. Decisions, once avoided, now feel relieving. Even difficult outcomes feel cleaner than endless waiting. The nervous system relaxes because life is moving again. Urgency replaces waiting when you realize that your future self is built by what you do now, not what you plan later. That realization is sobering but empowering. You stop bargaining with time, you respect it. What survives is momentum with meaning. You are not rushing life. You are participating in it. You act because alignment demands it, not because pressure forces it. Urgency becomes a form of self-respect. The unsettling truth is that waiting feels safe because it avoids exposure. But it quietly erodes agency. Urgency restores it. Once you cross this threshold, procrastination feels painful, not comforting. Delay feels dishonest. Movement feels clean. You begin choosing now, not later. You understand that life does not open up for those who wait perfectly. It responds to those who move deliberately. And from that place, urgency is no longer stress. It is clarity in motion. It is the moment you stop standing on the edge of your life and finally step into it. Trauma loosens its grip. Trauma does not announce itself loudly. It lives in reactions that feel bigger than the moment. In tension that appears without warning. In avoidance that feels logical until it costs you something. Most people do not realize trauma is running their life because it learned how to hide inside normal behavior. It calls itself caution. It calls itself strength. It calls itself who you are. Here is the shock. Trauma is not the memory of what happened. It is the nervous system still believing it is happening now. The body keeps score long after the event is over. Muscles stay tight. Breathing stays shallow. Attention stays alert. Psychologically, the brain prioritizes survival over truth, so it keeps old threat responses active even when the danger has passed. If you have ever overreacted and felt confused afterward, shut down when nothing obvious was wrong, or felt exhausted from being constantly on edge, this is why. Trauma is not weakness. It is a system that adapted perfectly to protect you at one point and never got the signal to stand down. Trauma loosens its grip the moment you stop fighting it. Most people try to think their way out of trauma. They analyze, explain, intellectualize. But trauma does not live in logic. It lives in the body. The nervous system does not respond to arguments. It responds to safety. The first shift happens when you notice your reactions without judging them. You feel the tightening, the rush, the urge to flee, freeze, or control. And instead of asking what is wrong with me, you ask what is my body trying to protect me from. That question alone begins to rewire the response. Curiosity replaces self-blame. Awareness replaces fear. This is uncomfortable. Trauma has long been treated as identity. People say this is just how I am. I am guarded. I am intense. I am distant. Letting go of trauma can feel like losing part of yourself. Ego resists because it confuses survival patterns with personality. But what loosens trauma is realizing that who you are exists underneath the response. The nervous system learns through repetition, not insight. Each time you stay present through a trigger without escalating, you teach the body something new. Each time you regulate your breath, relax your jaw, ground your feet, you send a signal of safety. Over time, the body updates. The threat response softens. Reactivity decreases. Space opens between stimulus and response. Trauma loosens its grip when the body trusts the present more than it fears the past. That trust is built slowly, gently, not by forcing exposure, but by restoring agency. You choose when to engage. You choose when to rest. You choose when to say no. Control returns not through dominance, but through choice. Relationships change here. Trauma once dictated closeness or distance automatically. Now you can feel connection without panic, boundaries without guilt, intimacy without collapse. You no longer confuse intensity with safety. Calm stops feeling boring and starts feeling trustworthy. Psychologically, this is integration. The brain no longer fragments experience into danger and relief. It learns continuity. You begin responding from the present moment rather than reacting from old memory. Emotional regulation improves not because you suppress feelings, but because feelings are no longer hijacking the system. This does not mean trauma disappears completely. It means it no longer drives. It may still whisper, but it no longer commands. Triggers become signals, not traps. You notice them, respond, and move on. Energy once spent on hypervigilance returns to creativity, focus, and connection. The threshold is crossed when you realize you are safe enough now to let go of constant protection. That realization is quiet but profound. The body exhales. Sleep deepens. Attention steadies. You feel more present in your own life because you are no longer scanning for danger that is not there. Trauma loosening its grip also changes self-perception. You stop seeing yourself as broken or damaged. You see adaptation, intelligence, resilience. Gratitude replaces shame. Compassion replaces judgment. You understand that your system did what it had to do, and now it can do something different. The unsettling truth is that trauma persists not because you are weak, but because your body learned too well. Releasing it does not erase the past. It honors it by no longer living there. When trauma loosens its grip, life becomes quieter inside. Not numb, clear. You respond instead of brace. You choose instead of flinch. Presence replaces anticipation. The past no longer rushes into the present uninvited. And from that place, you are not defined by what happened to you. You are defined by what you can hold now without collapsing. Calm becomes your baseline. Safety becomes internal. Trauma loosens its grip because you are no longer fighting life. You are finally living in it. Seeing imbalance clearly, imbalance is rarely dramatic. It does not crash into your life all at once. It creeps in quietly, disguised as normal. A little more giving than receiving, a little more effort than ease, a little more tolerance than truth. Over time, imbalance becomes familiar, and familiarity makes it invisible. You adjust, you compensate, you tell yourself this is just how things are. Here is the shock. You do not feel imbalance until your system can no longer carry it. The body notices long before the mind does. Fatigue without reason. Irritation that feels out of proportion. A subtle resentment you cannot explain. Psychologically, imbalance creates internal conflict because your actions no longer match your values. The nervous system experiences this as threat, even if everything looks fine on the surface. If you have ever wondered why you feel drained in situations that should be neutral, this is why. Imbalance steals energy quietly. It asks you to overextend emotionally, mentally, or physically without equal restoration. The mind rationalizes it. The body records it. And eventually, clarity forces its way in. Seeing imbalance clearly is not about blame. It is about perception sharpening. You start noticing patterns instead of isolated moments. Who initiates? Who compromises? Who adapts? Who carries emotional weight? You see where effort flows in one direction and stagnates in the other. Once seen, these patterns cannot be unseen. The discomfort intensifies here because awareness removes denial. You can no longer pretend you are fine with what you are tolerating. The nervous system reacts strongly to this stage because it knows change is coming. Anxiety increases not because something is wrong, but because something must shift. Most people respond by minimizing what they see. They explain it away. They remind themselves of history, loyalty, responsibility. But imbalance does not care about stories. It cares about cost, and the cost is always paid in energy, self-respect, or presence. The threshold is crossed when honesty outweighs comfort. When you admit, even quietly, this is not working anymore. That admission is powerful. Psychologically, naming imbalance restores internal coherence. The brain stops defending contradiction. The body exhales because truth is stabilizing, even when it is uncomfortable. Seeing imbalance clearly also changes how you relate to guilt. You realize guilt has been used to keep the imbalance intact. You felt guilty for wanting more balance, more rest, more reciprocity. That guilt dissolves when you see that fairness is not selfish. It is regulating. Relationships are often where imbalance becomes most visible. You notice how certain dynamics rely on your silence, flexibility, or emotional labor. When you stop compensating, the imbalance becomes obvious to others too. Some will adjust. Some will resist. Their reaction is information, not instruction. Internally, something strengthens. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop overriding your instincts. You begin trusting the signals that were always there. This trust recalibrates the nervous system. You no longer stay alert waiting for collapse. You address imbalance before it turns into resentment or burnout. Psychologically, clarity restores agency. When imbalance is unseen, you feel trapped. When it is seen, options return. You may not change everything immediately, but you are no longer confused. Confusion is replaced with discernment. Discernment is calming. Seeing imbalance clearly also reveals where you have abandoned yourself, where you said yes to avoid tension, where you stayed quiet to keep peace. This awareness can sting, but it is not punishment, it is guidance. The mind learns that self-abandonment is not sustainable, no matter how noble it sounds. The nervous system begins preferring balance over intensity. You stop confusing chaos with connection or exhaustion with meaning. Calm becomes desirable. Reciprocity becomes non-negotiable. You are no longer impressed by effort alone. You look for mutuality. This clarity changes your behavior subtly but decisively. You respond instead of react. You pause instead of appease. You set limits without over-explaining. Not because you are hardened, but because you are aligned. Alignment reduces internal friction, and with it, chronic stress. The unsettling truth is that imbalance often benefits someone else. Seeing it clearly threatens that arrangement. This is why clarity can feel lonely at first, but it is also why it is liberating. You are no longer participating unconsciously in dynamics that drain you. What survives this threshold is discernment. You know where you belong and where you do not. You invest energy where it returns. You withdraw where it is consistently depleted. This is not withdrawal from life. It is intelligent engagement with it. Seeing imbalance clearly is not about fixing everything immediately. It is about no longer lying to yourself. And once that happens, the nervous system relaxes. Energy returns. Decisions simplify. Life feels cleaner, not because it is perfect, but because it is honest. From this place, balance stops being a goal and becomes a standard. You no longer chase it. You choose it. And that choice quietly reshapes everything that follows. Emotional mastery emerges. Emotional mastery does not begin with control. It begins with awareness. You notice the emotion before it becomes behavior. The pause arrives earlier. The reaction slows down. For the first time, you feel the emotion without becoming it. That moment is small, but it changes everything. Here is the shock. Emotional mastery is not about feeling less. It is about being less owned by what you feel. Most people believe strength means suppressing emotion or acting unaffected. But suppression only stores emotion in the body, where it leaks out later as tension, resentment, or fatigue. True mastery allows emotion to move through without hijacking identity or decision-making. If you have ever said something you did not mean, stayed too long in something that hurt, or walked away from something good out of fear, you already know what lack of mastery costs. Emotions are not the problem. Unconscious reaction is. Psychologically, when emotion spikes without awareness, the nervous system shifts into threat response. Logic goes offline. Old patterns take over. Emotional mastery emerges when you stop trying to win against your emotions and start listening to them. Anger becomes information instead of explosion. Sadness becomes signal instead of collapse. Fear becomes data instead of paralysis. Each emotion has a function, and mastery means understanding the message without surrendering the steering wheel. This is uncomfortable at first. You feel emotions more clearly. There is no numbing, no bypassing. Ego resists because it prefers extremes. It wants you reactive or detached. Present awareness threatens those habits, but the nervous system learns quickly. When emotions are allowed without consequence, intensity decreases. What was once overwhelming becomes manageable. The first major shift is responsibility. You stop blaming emotions for behavior. You realize you can feel deeply and still choose precisely. That realization restores agency. You are no longer at the mercy of moods or triggers. You feel fully and act deliberately. This combination is rare, and it is powerful. Emotional mastery also changes how you relate to others. You stop expecting people to manage your feelings. You stop using emotion as leverage or shield. Communication becomes cleaner because you are not leaking unprocessed emotion into every interaction. Boundaries become clearer because they are not fueled by resentment or fear. Psychologically, this rewires emotional regulation. The prefrontal cortex stays engaged even during emotional activation. You can reflect while feeling. This reduces impulsivity and regret. The nervous system stabilizes because it trusts that emotions will be handled, not suppressed or indulged. Another shift happens internally. You stop judging yourself for what you feel. Shame dissolves. You no longer label emotions as good or bad. They simply are. This self-acceptance reduces internal conflict, which reduces stress. Energy once spent fighting yourself becomes available for presence and intention. Emotional mastery does not make you passive. It makes you precise. When you speak, it is measured. When you act, it is aligned. When you withdraw, it is intentional. You are no longer reactive, but you are far from numb. You feel more than before, but you are not overwhelmed by it. Fear changes role here. It no longer dictates avoidance. It informs discernment. You listen without obeying. This creates courage that is quiet and consistent. Not dramatic, not forced, just reliable. You move forward even when emotion is present, because emotion no longer equals danger. Relationships deepen under emotional mastery. You can hold discomfort without defensiveness. You can hear feedback without collapse. You can love without losing yourself. Conflict becomes navigable instead of explosive or avoidant. Presence replaces performance. Honesty replaces strategy. The threshold is crossed when emotions stop feeling like emergencies. You no longer rush to fix, explain, or escape them. You let them rise, peak, and pass. The nervous system learns that emotional waves are survivable. That lesson alone changes how you live. Over time, emotional mastery becomes identity. You trust yourself in intensity. You trust yourself in stillness. You trust yourself to respond rather than react. That trust creates calm, not because life is easy, but because you are steady. The unsettling truth is that emotional chaos was never strength. It was unprocessed experience. Emotional numbness was never peace. It was avoidance. Mastery lives in the middle, fully feeling, fully choosing. When emotional mastery emerges, life feels clearer. Decisions simplify, relationships stabilize, energy returns. You are no longer fighting your inner world or outsourcing control to circumstance. You are present, responsive, and grounded. Emotion no longer runs your life from the shadows. It stands beside you, informative and contained. And from that place, you move through the world with depth, clarity, and quiet power. Grieving a former version of you. Grieving a former version of you is one of the quietest losses you will ever experience. There is no ceremony for it. No one sends condolences. Most people around you do not even notice it happening. But internally, something is ending. A way you moved through the world. A version of you that survived, adapted, endured, and carried you through chapters that are now closed. Here is the shock. This grief does not mean you failed. It means you evolved. Psychologically, identity is built through repetition. Roles, habits, coping mechanisms, and beliefs wire themselves into who you think you are. When growth disrupts those patterns, the nervous system experiences loss, even if the change is healthy. The brain mourns familiarity before it celebrates alignment. You may feel sadness without a clear reason, nostalgia for periods of life that were objectively harder, a strange tenderness toward old behaviors you know you can no longer return to. This is not regression. It is integration trying to happen. The system is processing the cost of becoming someone new. Many people skip this grief. They rush forward, reinvent themselves, stay busy, distract. But ungrieved selves linger. They surface as doubt, self-judgment, or quiet resistance to growth. Grief is not optional. It is the bridge between who you were and who you are becoming. The first layer of this grief is compassion. You begin to see how much that former version of you carried, how they coped with limited tools, how they stayed in situations that no longer make sense now, how they tolerated, adapted, and survived without the awareness you have today. This realization softens self-blame. You stop judging past choices with present clarity. Then comes sadness. Real sadness. Not for what happened to you, but for how long you lived disconnected from yourself. You mourn the energy spent proving, pleasing, enduring. You mourn the times you silenced your instincts to stay safe or accepted. This sadness can feel heavy, but it is honest. The nervous system needs this release to move forward cleanly. Ego often resists here. It tells you to toughen up, move on, stop looking back. But grief is not weakness. It is neurological closure. Without it, the brain keeps old identity loops active, scanning for familiarity. With it, those loops can finally power down. As grief deepens, something unexpected happens. Gratitude emerges, not the forced kind, the grounded kind. You realize that former version of you did exactly what they were capable of at the time. They got you here. They deserve respect, not rejection. This reframes your history. Instead of seeing mistakes, you see adaptation. Instead of shame, you see intelligence under pressure. Grieving a former version of you also clarifies boundaries. You realize you cannot go back, even if parts of you want to. Old environments, dynamics, and expectations no longer fit your nervous system. Returning would require shrinking, numbing, or betraying awareness. The grief helps you accept that some doors must stay closed, not out of resentment, but out of coherence. This process is not linear. Some days you feel resolved. Other days you miss who you were, even if you know you outgrew them. That oscillation is normal. Identity does not dissolve overnight. It unwinds gradually as new patterns stabilize. The nervous system needs time to trust that the new way of being is safe. Relationships are often affected here. People who knew the old you may feel unfamiliar. They may try to pull you back into old roles without realizing it. This can hurt, not because they are wrong, but because you are different. Grieving your former self includes grieving how you were seen, how you were needed, how you belonged. That loss is real. Psychologically, this stage is essential for integration. The brain is updating its self-concept. Past, present, and future identities are being reconciled. When this process is allowed, internal conflict decreases. When it is avoided, fragmentation remains. You feel pulled between who you were and who you are becoming. As grief settles, clarity strengthens. You stop fantasizing about returning to old versions of yourself. You stop romanticizing survival. You understand that growth required loss, and loss does not negate progress. It validates it. Eventually, grief gives way to respect. You carry your former self with you, not as a weight, but as a foundation. You no longer need to disown them. You no longer need to apologize for them. You integrate their lessons without reenacting their limitations. The unsettling truth is that every meaningful transformation requires a death, not of the body, but of identity. Grieving a former version of you is how you honor that death without staying buried in it. It is how you move forward without dragging the past behind you. What survives this grief is wholeness. You are no longer split between who you were and who you are. You stand grounded in the present, informed by the past, oriented toward the future. Energy returns because it is no longer trapped in unresolved identity. Grieving a former version of you does not make you weaker. It makes you integrated. You stop fighting your history. You stop running from it. You let it complete. And from that place, becoming someone new no longer feels like betrayal. It feels like continuation.